Good morning, colleagues. Welcome to the reconvened Police and Crime Panel, first of the municipal year. Please note that the proceedings of this meeting are at this moment being recorded and streamed live on the internet. So please be aware of that. Our microphones will pick you up. Before we proceed with the nominations of Chair and Vice Chair in line with the panel's procedures, I'd like to bring to your attention some housekeeping matters. Please switch your mobile telephones off. If you wish to speak during the meeting, I would ask that you raise your hand and wait for the chair to invite you to speak. We were going to use the electronic voting system today, but given the content of the agenda, we don't think it's required, so we won't use it unless directed by the committee. Any panel member may stand for election of chair of this committee, and the candidate receiving the most votes from amongst those present will be elected. If there are three or more candidates for a position and none has more than half the votes, the candidate with the fewest votes will be eliminated and a new vote taken. This will continue until one candidate has more than half the votes. So I'll move on to agenda item 1, which is the appointment of chair for the municipal year 23-24. Could I seek nominations? Councillor Penberthy.
I'd like to nominate Councillor Sally Hayden.
Do I have a second? Councillor Wright. Councillor Crode.
Thank you. I'd like to nominate Councillor Kevin Towell for chair.
Thank you, Councillor Crode. Can I have a second? Councillor Toms, I saw your hand first. So members, I think it's most useful if I call your name and if you can respond with the candidate you wish to take the chair. I'll start with Councillor Alvey, but I think Councillor Guest, you're substituting. So Councillor Alvey, Councillor Hayden or Councillor Towell?
Councillor Towell.
Councillor Towell. Councillor Tilby?
Councillor Towell.
Councillor Tilby. In fact, rather than going through around the room, I'm going to take them in the order that I've got in front of me, if that's all right. Councillor Chopak.
Councillor Towell.
Councillor Crode.
Councillor Towell.
Councillor Ewings.
Councillor Hayden.
Councillor Hackett. Is there a substitute? No. Councillor Hayden, yourself. Yeah. Councillor Kennedy.
Councillor Towell.
Councillor Lever. Councillor Hayden. Councillor Loudon, his apologies. Councillor Penberthy, I'm assuming Councillor Hayden. Councillor Rogers. Councillor Thomas.
Abstain.
Councillor Toms.
Councillor Towell.
Councillor Towell. Councillor Towell. Councillor Timon. Councillor Wright. Councillor
Hayden.
Councillor Hayden. Sharon Minty.
Councillor Hayden.
Councillor Goodman Bradbury.
Councillor Hayden.
Well, I'm hoping my maths is correct. I believe it is. Councillor Towers pulled 8. Councillor Hayden, 7. So, Councillor Towell, would you like to come and join me in a moment? Shall I do the Vice Chair first? Yeah. Thank you. So, Councillor Towell is appointed Chair. Just to save movement now, we'll move straight on to the Vice Chair. So, can I ask for nominations for Vice Chair?
I'd like to nominate Councillor Hayden.
Can I have a second? Councillor Towell. Same again then, please, members. Councillor Alvey or Councillor Guest?
Councillor Hayden.
Councillor Hayden. Well, is there any other nominations, actually? Can everyone show in favour of Councillor Hayden? Appreciated. Councillor Hayden, would you like to come and join us? Councillor Towell, would you like to come and join us? Can you bring your nameplates with you? That would be appreciated. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, committee. During the next 12 months, I see it as my role as chair to support you in your role as scrutineers to the commissioner, and you will have my 100% support in your roles in doing that. So thank you very much. Vice Chair, would you like to say a few words?
No, I'm just more than happy to support the chair and the committee in the year ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to apologies. Do we have any apologies, Ross?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies from Councillor Alvey. Councillor Guest is representing. We've also received apologies from Councillor Loudon and Councillor Hackett. Fran Hughes, Chief Exec for the OPCC, is also provided apologies due to the date change. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And we'll move on to the minutes now. If members can bear with me, I will power up my laptop because the pages are set out differently with the paperwork I've got in front of me. So, one moment. Oh, thank you. Okay, going through the minutes for accuracy, page 1. Page 2. 3. 4. 5. 6. 7, 8, 9, and 10. I'll propose those minutes as a true and accurate record. Vice Chair, you weren't on the panel.
I wasn't present, I'm afraid, but Councillor Crode.
Councillor Crode, thank you. All in favour? Okay, thank you. Any abstentions? And any against? Okay, those are carried. Thank you. Moving on to item 5, declarations of interest. Are there any interest to declare?
Chair, I'd like to declare an interest as I work for First Light, who's mentioned in the contracts of the Commissioner's report.
Thank you. And I would like to declare a non-registrable interest, as I am the holder of a firearms licence. Thank you. We now move on to public questions, and we have a question from Mr. Snow today. Mr. Snow?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Right, my question is, how is the Police and Crime Panel going to tackle officers not telling the truth, and how it intends to tackle police victimisation and corruption within the force? I actually have evidence here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. We have a prepared answer, which will be read out by our officer. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The Police and Crime Panel has no formal role in respect of the conduct of officers. The Chief Constable and delegates are accountable to the Commissioner, not the panel. As the body responsible for the scrutiny of the Commissioner, the panel will request a response from the Commissioner as to her confidence in the system in place at Devon and Cornwall Police to deal with matters of conduct.
So, given that answer, could we invite the Commissioner to have any input in that?
Thank you, Chair, and congratulations, by the way, to both of you for leading the panel. What I can share with you is my role in relation to this, so that there is clarity, because obviously I do not hold individual police officers to account for their conduct. It's only the Chief Constable. And I'm absolutely clear, obviously, that rooting that out of this police force is the role of the Chief Constable himself. Where the behaviour currently falls below standards, it's important that the police service is open and transparent and accountable, and the Chief Constable is the appropriate authority for the decision to dismiss, suspend police officers. In terms of my role is to ensure that the Chief Constable carries out that, including managing misconduct and corruption. And I do this in several ways. Firstly, I hold the Chief Constable to account and regularly review misconduct performance and matters arising from misconduct proceedings. Secondly, my team closely monitors the management of police conduct through the Police Professional Standards and Ethics Board within the force, and I have recently made strong representations to the College of Policing on their review of the Policing Code of Ethics, which they are in the process of changing, and that sets out the behaviours expected of police officers. Thirdly, I have responsibility for appointing and selecting the legally qualified chairs for police misconduct panels, and these panels preside over serious misconduct cases. Fourth is that I also have a role in considering the very significant matter of forfeiture of police officer pensions for officers convicted of a criminal offence that is liable to lead to a serious loss of confidence in the police service. And finally, I am the appropriate authority for the Chief Constable themselves, which means that I'm responsible for taking action, such as considering complaints against the Chief Constable and considering suspension or dismissal in cases of serious conduct matters. What I would suggest is that people who have witnessed or suspects any conduct that falls below the policing standards of professional behaviour can report it to the Police Professional Standards Department within Devon and Cornwall Police. And police employees have an anonymous hotline run by Crime Stoppers called the Police Integrity Line, in which they can report their concerns anonymously.
Thank you very much for putting that on the record, Commissioner. Moving on. Next we have item 7, Devon and Cornwall Firearms licensing. These, of course, are to the tragic shootings in Plymouth. Commissioner, the floor is yours to take us through the report.
Thank you, Chair. You see we've got two reports on the meeting today. One is about the actions that me and my office have taken since the incident that happened in Keyham in holding the Chief Constable to account. We have the other one around the whole work on recovery for the Keyham and wider Plymouth city. And you'll be hearing a presentation from the University of Plymouth on that one afterwards. But I'll focus just specifically, since this report was published, we've had two updates that have happened, which I will just share with you. I believe you may have been sent the HMIC FRS letter and report on the inspection. So I part-funded that with the policing minister to give me assurance and the policing minister assurance that our firearms licensing department had delivered against recommendations from the IOPC. And there's some positive news in there, but still work to be done. But I think I can reassure you, and I feel reassured that the department is working safely for our residents across Devon, Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. And the second thing that's happened since this report was published is that the policing minister has responded, the government has responded to those coroner's recommendations. And there are a couple of elements which will be of interest to you. One is that he's committed £500,000 to help train nationally firearms licensing officers, as part of the issue was that there wasn't any accredited training in place. And secondly, in particular, he said he won't change the legislation around the propensity to, if you like, honour a firearms licence certificate for a resident, but is looking at a consultation around the level of fees for the cost of firearms licensing, and that is out at the moment. And I would urge all members and all residents, if they have a view on that, to go onto the government website. It's only open till the end of August in order to put their views across. So those are two bits of news that have happened since we published this report. And I suppose the element that I particularly want to focus on is we're in Plymouth at the moment. We're coming up to 2 years since this tragedy, it's absolute awful incident happened here. And the police had to take responsibility for issuing a firearm to a man who should not have had one. And I think fundamentally the level of investment that we've put into that department, the level of leadership that has gone in to support the management and supervision in that department, it is a completely looking, you'll see the level of numbers in that HMIC letter that we are now near 100 people investment into that department now. I will say in terms of the elements of cost, you know, we've invested large amounts of money into this department. We have challenges still around efficiency. I think there's more to be done around how well they actually are able to work within that budget envelope. But I am reassured that it is now much safer, and the report today that has been released from HMI does help reiterate that. There are some key learnings out of some of the elements as well. We have chosen to also decouple from Dorset Police as a department. So this was an alliance department developed under austerity to make a savings, to work together with Dorset Police. Both the Dorset Police and Crime Commissioner, myself, and the two Chief Constables have decided to decouple, and that is currently underway at the moment. So we will be holding our own department, and the Chief Constable will be the person who I can hold to account for the performance, efficiency and effectiveness of that department. And it makes it, I think, a lot stronger. I won't linger. I just thought I'd highlight some of the new elements that have come in since this report was published, Chair, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Also, members will have found a hard copy of the letter from His Majesty's Inspectorate. So I think this section would be an appropriate section as well to ask questions on that. Thank you. So any questions? Thank you. Councillor Penberley.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the update, Commissioner. Obviously, it's really difficult to look at the range of reports that are now emerging following the Keyham incident almost 2 years ago, and you know, that resonates still with lots of us who experienced it, and certainly for those of us locally. who know people living in the area, and as it was happening, were worrying about what was happening to our friends and family. You've talked about funding, and I want to talk about funding because the coroner specifically talked about budgetary limitations and staff shortages, and obviously we welcome the fact that you're addressing that. But in most areas of licensing, and I'm sure some of us here as cabinet members have responsibility for various licensing schemes, we're meant to cover the full cost of the licenses being issued through the charges. It would be really useful, and you might need to do this in a note to us afterwards, but within the time of the consultation, for us to understand the difference between what income is being generated and the costs of issuing each license, because that is money that's being taken out of other policing areas because of the actions you've taken. And I would have thought it was reasonable for us to understand that difference as members to feed into any representations we might want to make as member authorities. And I think that was something I think is probably a relatively easy request, but one that I think would help us, and certainly here in Plymouth, I would want to know that, and I'm sure Councillor Hayden would, as we draft our response. I have read through the document we only received this morning, so obviously we're all a bit on the hoof with that one. But I did want to ask you about temporary licences. Although the document overall is sort of positive, the section on page 9 about temporary licences is less so. And I wanted to know where you were seeking assurance, where it says that, you know, the numbers we issue are way outside the numbers normally issued, that they're being applied for retrospectively, so people are holding firearms, being issued with licences, but no apparent police action appearing to be taken for unlicensed firearms being held, people applying at the wrong times, which means that once again they are unlawfully holding firearms. Those are quite serious given the background to this report. And I know this wasn't a temporary licence and that was something different, but obviously as a panel we want to be assured that risk in other areas is covered, and that seems to be one of those that there is still substantial risk. So it'd be interesting to hear your comments on those two areas if possible. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. The fees issue is a really interesting one, and about the cost of actually issuing the licence. And it's been one of my upsets, because I am moving money from policing with the Chief Constable from other areas in order to fund this. And it is fundamentally a customer service product that the police are supplying. It would be very happy to get that data for you in relation to the costs. Forces throughout the country all cost slightly differently, because they all do it in a slightly different way. And this inconsistency is one of the challenges I think came through in the coroner's report. But be very happy to help you respond to that, particularly as a panel. In terms of the issues of temporary licensing, one of the things that I'm sure you will understand is, following the Keyham incident, Devon and Cornwall Police became extremely risk-averse culturally in issuing firearms licences. Then there was some changes to the guidance from the Home Office, and more checks were needing to be carried out, and it just brought the system to quite a halt almost. And we had to train new people up before they could do some of those jobs, and there's still people now being trained up to be able to make decisions in some of those licensing arrangements. So even though we've made those investments, not everybody is capable of making the risk-based decisions without full training, and so it's been a very slow process. I'm obviously not happy about the temporary licence issue, because it is just creating more work. It's inefficient, and I think that's what comes through that HMIC report, is you might be safe, but there are clear inefficiencies in your processes which are causing you more problems for the long term. So we've got a new Assistant Chief Constable, Jim Pearce, who some of you may formally know as the Cornwall Commander here in Devon and Cornwall, who oversees this department now. And he's got a strategy and a plan in place to actually reduce the use of temporary licences. I'm fairly confident at this point, with the regular reporting that is happening between the force and my office and me to the Minister, I am still regularly reporting to the Minister, that we have clear oversight and clarity on what's going on. Yes, I'm disappointed we're still in that position, but I think the biggest issue, that's the positive one, is that Devon and Cornwall Police are doing this safely, and I think that was our biggest concern as we entered into all of this.
Do you wish to come back?
If I could, that would be great. The reason I raised it is that the report explicitly says that the routine issuing of temporary permits to manage demand is contrary to statutory guidance. So the systems being used actually contravene statutory guidance. Surely, therefore, we should not be using temporary licences, and people might have to wait, rather than having a licence issued contrary to statutory guidance, just in order to manage processes while we get up to speed.
Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Chair. Sticking on the same report about the firearms, you've talked very shortly about the Alliance, how you're breaking away. We see in the report we've got this morning, we've gone from 45 to 99 members of staff. How many of them staff are alliances, and how many are from the police force, please?
So those numbers are just in Devon and Cornwall, so they're not alliance staff, although they're classified as a whole resource across two, but those are the Devon and Cornwall ones. I couldn't tell you the breakdown between police staff and police officers, but most of those will be police officers, because in order to do this speedily, that was the resource that was able to be moved quickly into the department. But I don't have the breakdown fully for you. But they are our Devon and Cornwall employed police officers and staff.
Thank you, Chair. If I can carry on. If I hog the meeting, please do say. And thank you for that. My concern was of how many we might be losing by moving forward. So you've assured me on that one. I really hate talking about money in these circumstances, but I think you'll be aware, Commissioner, about the inquest, the falling of the cost of 400k that Plymouth City Council has had to put forward. I know you've done some work in the past. I'm wondering if you would support a further call for Plymouth City Council's financial support to try and get some more funding back.
Sorry, Vice Chair, I don't quite understand the... Yeah.
Okay. So, as Police and Crime Commissioner might be aware, the cost of the inquest has fallen on Plymouth City Council. The cost of the inquest. So, are you understanding now? Sorry.
I do feel for Plymouth City Council. The cost of the inquest and the litigation costs for the police have been rather large as well. Are you unable to claim that back from the government then? Is it fall upon you? I don't know what the rules around it are.
Yes, it does. It has fell upon Plymouth City Council.
Yeah. So I suppose the issue is, the biggest challenge we all face is how do we prevent any sort of issues going on in our communities happening. And fundamentally, there isn't just a life cost, there's a financial cost, and then it impacts other services. So I just feel for Plymouth City Council, if you're unable to reclaim those costs back, obviously I would not be, unless you're going to try and judicially review me to give you money in some way, shape or form, be able to support the costs of that.
I think, Commissioner, what I'm looking for is your support. That's what I'm looking for. So if we have your support, do not panic. I was not asking from your budget. Okay?
I'm happy to support any letters or visits that you may need in order to have a conversation about that.
That's fabulous. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Toms.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Because I've not been on the panel for some time, I did a bit of research and I looked back at some of the minutes and everything else to try to get myself up a little bit up to speed. And I can see that in the report or the letter that we got this morning that, the staff shortages, we've gone from 45 to 99. I think there was an element in there about freedom to do their job. And I think that because you've probably done this extra training, I think allow them to do their job. And the low risk licenses, we could perhaps, help the flow of the system. I'm hoping that the new IT will bring benefits and speed the system up and give you greater confidence in that, and help with a better process of, the flow of everything, which is good. But when it comes down to the actual number of licenses, when you think that on a 52-week year, that there are 731 every week that need to be processed. Of those, 71 were temporary licenses, so the value of 9.5% against the rest is not acceptable in my book, because there looks like they're coming back every year multiple times to get temporary licenses, and the late production of license applications is also an issue. But there's one real question that when I was doing my research that really stuck with me. We're talking about people that are in the main honest and they come and get their license, and yet there's somewhere in the region of 900,000 illegal firearms in this country. What are we going to do about those? Because I've got no doubt with that sort of number that there will be spread pretty evenly across the country, maybe more in the cities, but in relation to the number of population, there are probably a lot, because I see in the report there were 70 knives that were confiscated, and it says 6 other items. What those are, I don't know, whether it was guns or not. And will we be having a gun amnesty in the near future? Because I know that's brought benefits in the previous past. I'm sorry so many questions, but being new, I looked at this quite thoroughly. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor, thank you for doing your research before you came to get yourself up to speed. I think in terms of as you're talking about the illegal firearms that will be around in this country, I haven't got an answer for you today, but it is certainly something I can go away and look at. I mean, one of the main questions that gets asked when we have a homicide is, was there any illegal or legal weapons involved in what had happened? Safe to say, many of ours do not involve illegal firearms, but I will go back and have a check and get some information for you on that. We have had knife amnesties in the past, and we tend to do those once or twice a year. Gun amnesties, I believe we have done, but I can't remember or recall the last one that had happened. So, again, that is something for me to take away and have a think about, Councillor. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Councillor. Next we have Sharon Minty? No? Kennedy. Oh, sorry. Next we have Councillor Kennedy.
Thank you, Chair. Nice to see you again, Commissioner. It's been a year or two. A lot of these will be actually related to the Home Office one, so it's something perhaps you can come back in due course. But my first question, over the last 50 years, I served as a police officer and a politician scrutinising the police ever since. 16 of those years I was a firearms officer, and I've faced illegal firearms, so I know roughly how many are out there, and there's a lot more now than then. I'm delighted to see the effort, practically and financially, that's gone into improving the administration of firearms licences. But I am very concerned about the operational impact of police officers who are out seizing firearms, and they must come across them in a day-to-day routine. We certainly always did. I notice in the Home Office report, and it's difficult to extrapolate the right information, they reviewed 5 cases where licenses were revoked. That seems an awfully low number in the 2 years, but I appreciate that's their report and not yours. Especially when it goes on to the temporary permits, of which they identify 43 individuals who held firearms unlawfully. Again, is that a delay in the system or an offence by the holders? And I appreciate that's not the sort of thing you're going to have in front of you, but thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kennedy, and welcome. Yes, long time no see, so nice to see you on the panel. One of the issues around the 43 that were still illegally obtained, still had their firearm, what we have found when we've scrutinised this quite a bit, because in our reporting every month we've been asking that question, and what we've tended to find is there's a number of reasons. One has been because somebody has died, and they haven't come in to renew their firearm, obviously, and it's just left there. So that's come about, and often the families don't all know the processes of what they need to do when those things happen. So there's some issues about communicating with bereaved families around, because that seems to be one of the reasons why we have got people who have still got them and they're not actually there. But those are the sorts of issues as to why they still have them. It's not because they're trying to hold them illegally or they've forgotten to do an application process. It tends to be for wider reasons that are a bit more difficult to resolve until someone tells you that they have passed away and the right information's come across. So it's those sorts of issues that seems to have been particularly those 43, things like that.
Thank you. I am going to invite the two Plymouth members to come back in to finish up, but before we do that, are there any other questions from the panel? Yes, Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Chair. Going back to the resourcing in the new report that we've just seen this morning, I'm concerned about the high vacancies in the admin roles, because obviously to process all these licences, it's really good that extra has gone into supervisory roles, but the admin is going to be very important. And staff have said this is due to a low pay grade. And I think I've been told what this pay is, the hourly rate is actually under £15 an hour, from what I've heard. So to recruit somebody into a vital role where the admin of this is going to be so important to make sure things aren't missed and slipped. We would support, yes, I'm glad that you want an increase in fees, and we're all going to go away and do that consultation as far as we can individually and within our councils if we can, due to the timescale, because it does seem ridiculous that at the moment you have to apply for a licence fee to watch the BBC, which I'm happy to do, with £159 a year to apply for a licence to have something that is obviously a lethal instrument is £79.80 a year. So is it possible that the panel chair could note and express support for the Commissioner going forward with her request to have these fees increased?
Thank you. I think we'll come back to that item after the Commissioner's response. So if
Thanks, Chair. Councillor, I don't have an update as to whether those admin roles have been filled since we published this report, so just bear with me on that. But as we all know, in local government, in all public sector, administrators are often the most lowest paid and yet the most critical people who keep everything going and together and recorded and proper. So I will go back and double check where we're at with the recruitment of those administrators. In terms of what might be helpful is I'm just thinking my draft response to that consultation in relation to the fees might be worth sharing with panel members to consider using any of that information that I put into my response that might be useful for panel. And if panel wants to come back and endorse my response to the consultation, that might be a way of doing it. I'm not into full cost recovery because that drives inefficiencies. And puts the burden on the customer. So there's got to be, I think we need to come up with a level of fee that we think is rational and appropriate. So I've still got to go in and respond to that. So that might be a way of involving the panel in what that final response can look like.
Would you be happy with that, Councillor Wright? I think that would be a bit more formal than than an informal vote today, and that could be placed clearly on the record.
Yes, I would, personally. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor, sorry, how do you pronounce your name again? Apologies.
Ewings.
Ewings.
Yes, thank you.
Councillor Ewings.
Firstly, I apologise for leaving the room, but I had a consultant phone me from Derriford, and they're very hard to miss phone calls. So thank you for that, and thank you to the councillor for bringing my point forward for me. I would just like to ask if the Commissioner and her team have considered whether there could be a difference in the pricing of a licence. For a farmer, a shotgun can be essential. And if there's proof they're on the farm, they own the farm, or have a proper tenancy on the farm, that's a slightly different rate for somebody who's just going out clay pigeon shooting or whatever. If it's for recreation, I think people should pay more. And I think the farmers who do need them and who can be proven farmers, then I think there should be a slightly reduced fee, because in rural parts of Devon and Cornwall, you know, these things are essential to their day job as opposed to people for recreational use.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor, one of the things is that actually it's for all business use is probably the issue. It's not just farmers that require a gun to be able to do it. We've got vets, all sorts of people like that. I think the challenge we've got is how can it still only be £79.50 for 5 years, not even every year, for 5 years, when the gun will cost more than that. You know, this is where it is absolutely out of kilter with, I would say, public feeling. For those who don't use any sort of guns in their day-to-day life, that feels odd anyway. And I think gun users accept that it's time for change. It did go up about, I think it was in 2012 was the last increase that they did in firearms licence fees. So we haven't even moved with the time. So I just think I don't think they could justify that it is only that over a 5-year period. So I think the tiering structure is an interesting one. So again, my office is yet to fully respond to that consultation. So as you might imagine, we've been quite busy lately. So we'll make sure that we'll get that draft to you, and you can have a view.
Thank you. Do you wish to come back?
Anecdotally, I think 2 years ago now there was a group of gentlemen, let's say, who'd come for a shooting weekend and stayed in a Wetherspoons. This was in Tavistock on the night of Dickensian evening, so you could imagine all hell broke loose. I was helping to marshal. An officer came up in an unmarked, "You need to move now, I need to get there," explained what he was, down we escorted him. Out came that night about a dozen guns. There was several officers, and it was a big thing, and all they were done is come shooting for the weekend. And I was like, why didn't you stay in X or Y, which has gun facilities? They then had to take them all to Plymouth. So the cost of all that, just for them to come away for a shooting weekend for a laugh, it's not on. And that is all the fee they pay. And that night would have cost the police thousands of pounds. So something has to be done.
Any other questions? Councillor Chopek.
Sir, hopefully a simple one, and thank you for being open and honest this morning. This is going back to the decoupling, and it's all around budgets, I know. Obviously on page 2 even, it doesn't suggest anything around timelines for that. So I'm just wondering if you have a specific idea about that. And are you concerned, or how is your own homework going to be marked, if you like, if, you know, making sure that nobody slips through the net that should have gone to Dorset or to Devon and Cornwall? So how are we making sure that the decoupling process is very accurate?
Thank you, Councillor. There's two rationales for choosing to decouple with Dorset. One is it's really hard for Dorset to hold their Chief Constable to account when the host force for the alliance function is the Chief Constable for Devon and Cornwall. So there was an unhappiness, and I was unhappy because it's really hard to hold them to account when they're sort of a shared function, and it's sort of whose responsibility is it? So part of the rationale is to have absolutely clear line of responsibility and accountability. But secondly, we did a public survey together, both the Police and Crime Commissioner for Dorset and myself, with the public who are firearms licensing holders. And one of the questions was around how has the service been over the years? And basically the feedback was it's got awfully worse since you were in an alliance. So I think from a customer perspective as well, we decided that a decoupling was the right thing to do. Now, the timeline to me would have been 2 years ago, hope that we'd have done it. But all these processes, the coronial process, everything's had to wait until we've got absolute clarity on what the problems are and what the issues are. But our timeline for this year was, I'm going to say September off the top of my head, but I would have to double check. We were waiting for performance to stabilise, so we have absolute clarity on the performance before we decouple. And because we've had so much investment and training and new people, we need it to stabilise before we actually make that final mark. We've made the decision to do it, but the point at which it actually happens is when it's all completely stable. And I believe September was our aim, but that's off the top of my head, I'm afraid, Councillor.
Sort of supplementary to that, is it possible that, say, in our next panel, you could come back to us with an update just on that point? Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, you spoke about how the force is understandably risk averse now in terms of the granting, which I completely understand. And I note from page 7 of the document we've received this morning that refusal rate is now at 7%. Would you anticipate it to remain at that sort of level, or is it going to drop back? Is that a reflection of the risk aversion, or just as a one-off in terms of applications?
I know it has increased a lot. We have had a lot of challenge from licence holders, and some of them have won in court, linked to the legislation issue about the propensity to offer the licence unless there are particular reasons. So I would expect, as the performance stabilises, as the team are fully trained, as we decouple, I think it may well change. But that's me on a whim saying that, as opposed to there's a plan to change that, or there's an active effort to change that. In a situation where you've had this, to follow the guidance and do everything by the book and be really strict, it's not until the confidence of those people who are issuing those license in the people that they're dealing with and what they do, till that builds, it will be by the book, you know, to the letter and all of those things. So I can't say there's a strategy or plan to reduce that. It is just what it is at the moment, and I know it is higher than the national average.
It's almost double the national average. Could I suggest, from where I'm sitting, that is no bad thing? And to the book, and by the letter, actually ought to be our constant mark rather than a change. I accept the point you're making. I do understand what you're saying, but actually I think that's an absolutely fabulous standard to judge ourselves by the book and on the mark.
Thank you, Councillor. Ross, our officer, has been listening to the views of the panel, and he is cooking up a form of words in a form of a recommendation or two for the panel to consider. But before we do that, I would like to invite Councillor Pemberby to come back with any questions or any input.
Thank you, Chair. And isn't this a difficult topic to be discussing? Before I do anything else, I just want to talk about the other parts of the alliance, because clearly this was something that we were told would make a big difference and seems to have actually driven us backwards. how are you ensuring that all the other parts of the alliance are properly accountable, given the problems of this accountability, that they are driving efficiencies and service improvement? Because it would appear that if it's a problem here, it's probably a problem in all the other places because you have exactly the same issues underlying it. It's probably not an answer for now, but I think maybe, Chair, we should actually look at the other services that are Alliance services and whether they are fit for purpose as Alliance services or whether they need to be brought back in-house. So that's a sort of tangential, but something that, as I've been listening to the conversation, I just wanted to mention. If we're going to do things by the book, I think you should ask your officers to stop issuing temporary licences. It's as simple as that. You're in breach of statutory guidance, or the police service is in breach of statutory guidance, and they should meet statutory guidance. And I think that you need to put some pressure on to do that. I'm also concerned when you talk about the timelines and timeliness, that if we wait for everything to be perfect, decoupling will never happen. I think at a strategic level, you and your counterpart in Dorset need to put some pressure on the Chief Constables to actually set a timeline with a date so that we can all know that proper accountability is in place. Because if it's September now and it comes back, oh, well, this is this and this, it'll just roll and roll and roll. And so actually that doesn't sound to me as an appropriate degree of urgency to get this back in place because we're waiting for perfect before we decouple, when actually the reason that we need to decouple is it's not perfect. And so we're a chicken and egg situation. If I could just reflect on full cost recovery, whilst it can be difficult to do and drive efficiencies, I think in all of the licensing authorities here, whether we're talking about premises licenses, DPSs, whether we're talking about HMO licensing, all the other things that we do as authorities that we have to cover our costs on, some of those on annual, some of them on 5 years, some of them on one-offs, we work the costs out and we do it and we drive efficiencies. If you were to put the cost of a firearms license up by 10% because you've got an inefficient service, you'd have a massive backlash. In putting prices up, you need to ensure that you are both being efficient and offering good service, because the customers otherwise will react. So I think full cost recovery is appropriate because you have to look at the efficiencies when you are doing it. And it's something I look at every year when we review the HMO licensing, which brings me on to my next point. We should be arguing for annual reviews of licensing fees so that actually they increase incrementally rather than in big jumps. But full cost recovery needs to cover all of those things in an efficient service. This is a customer service. People have choice as to whether they own a gun or not. And if they choose to own a gun, they need to cover the cost of your services delivering that, because that shouldn't be taken off the streets of our communities. And just a final thought on shotguns. I'm not a gun expert. I don't know that I've ever held a gun. Well, I might have done on an armed forces day, but I wouldn't know one from another. My understanding is that this was a pump action shotgun. Shotguns are used not only in rural communities, and in this case, my understanding was that if we'd given a discount for a shotgun, we'd have given a discount to someone who used it to commit murder. So let's be very careful before we say which sort of gun is more lethal or depends a different sort of charging. A gun is a gun, and we need to be aware of that. And I think from my perspective, as someone who isn't there as a gun owner or a gun user, a gun is a gun, and I think that would be the same for the vast majority of the public in Devon and Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. I think there's probably not lots of stuff in terms of answers, but just reflections as I've been listening as a Plymouth councillor to the discussion this morning. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that input, Councillor. Commissioner, do you have any reflections on that?
I'll just reflect on a couple of things. yes to bringing a report on the alliance departments. We have had discussions with Dorset. We've had regular governance meetings, oversight of performance and all of those things. So happy to consider an alliance report here in the future for all of the departments. Just to say on the decoupling, part of the challenge and why it's been a little bit slow since we made the decision, I'm trying to recall when I made the decision, I think it was this January, I want to say for January or February this year is when we formally made the decision at a meeting, is that we've had to buy our way out of it, be frank with you. All of the staff are on Devon and Cornwall side, so Dorset have to recruit some of those police staff roles. So that's part of the wait until they've got their police staff roles in position that we can then do the decoupling and that they're trained up. So there's some issues about the decoupling because we host it, so most of the staff, they're all owned by Devon and Cornwall Police, but they work out of Dorset Police. You know, it's been a bit of a tricky one. And I get your point about full cost recovery, but if you saw across the country that some people, it's like £500 it would cost you in one police force, and it might be 125 in another. And as it's a monopoly provider, it's a bit uncomfortable having such disparities between forces due to either size and scale of the numbers you've got going through or efficiency issues. So I think there is some arguments on both ways of that. I think that's it, Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Councillor Hayden.
Thank you, Chair. And Councillor Penberthy's put quite a lot over that I was going to ask anyway. But just going back to the report we received today, on page 2, when we look at the summary, the force has implemented 4 of the 5 IOPC recommendations. The force doesn't agree with the wording of the recommendation 4. Could you just give us some idea of where we're going with that recommendation 4, please?
Thank you, Councillor. If you actually read it in the cold light of day as a layperson, it will actually make sense to you as to why it doesn't make sense. Because what it's actually saying is that we should discriminate firearms licence holders in a justice process, and that is not appropriate. I'm disappointed that the HMIC hasn't been formally justifying or agreeing with the force's disagreement about that. But what it's basically saying is we should be making a different justice decision if you have a firearm than if you don't. And that is, those two things you can't put them together. So I support the force in their challenge on that one because it wouldn't be appropriate. But for some reason, no one wants to admit that it's worded wrong. So that's the way I would see it at the moment. I have not seen the IOPC's response to the force in relation to their challenge that they did in May.
I really do need to go back to the firearms, I'm afraid. And obviously, you know and you're full aware of the backlog of applications. I don't expect you to have the number to hand. But obviously, you're also talking about the separations from the alliances. What have you got in place regarding the backlog of applications, please?
In terms of dealing with that backlog, I mean, obviously in the report we talk about the investment in people, we talk about some improvements in the system. I think the biggest challenge for us is the number of, we have the largest firearms licence holders in the country, and the scale of that is challenging for the force at the best of times. At the moment, there are some very bold decisions that the force will consider making and have started to make around that backlog in terms of how they prioritise it. For example, if you are a business user for it, you may get prioritised if you're in that backlog. The challenge we've got at the moment is more is coming in than can be processed. And the answer is not just throwing more people at it. It'll take ages to do that. So I think there's some bold decisions that the force will need to make around how they deal with that backlog. They have a plan at the moment. They're quite clear that they've got a performance framework. And I think it'd be really helpful if, in terms of the conversation about an Alliance future report, that we bring to you, because this report is about how I've held the Chief Constable to account since the Keyham incident, but we can bring you a performance report and how we're dealing with those things at a future meeting, if you prefer. So you've got transparency of that.
Chair, I certainly would welcome that, because hopefully we would get some sort of timing as well of where we're going. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your input. Yes, Councillor.
Just an add-on to a point that Councillor Penberthy made was when he said about temporary licences being stopped. I was just going to ask, would the guns be confiscated until the people had the appropriate licence? I don't need a reply now.
I'm afraid, Councillor, I can't answer that question. I don't run the process, and it is a complicated decision-making process, that. Not that I can't do complicated, Chairman. But it's operational, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Thank you, Commissioner. Ross, you've been working on a form of words in the form of 2 recommendations, I believe.
Thank you, Chair. I think we've picked up a number of actions from that conversation that you might need to consider for your work programme going forward. So those include timeline around decoupling. Sorry, I'll speak closer into my microphone, Councillor. So a timeline around decoupling and a future report around the alliance and the impact on departments wider than just firearms licensing. So a number of things there I think we'll discuss in our work programme and make sure that colleagues at the OPCC are aware of timescales around those. The other action which I think we'll need to leave to the OPCC and Plymouth City Council is around the cost of inquests and how that indication of support for those covering of those costs might be forthcoming. And I think then there's 2 recommendations for your consideration, councillors. Now, firstly, the Commissioner has suggested you may wish to endorse her response to the consultation currently underway, given where we are in terms of our meeting dates and when I think the consultation closes on the 23rd of August. It might be sensible to delegate the endorsement of the Commissioner's response to the panel lead officer in consultation with the panel members and chair. So that would be the first recommendation. And what I've not picked up is a requirement for the panel to respond directly to the consultation. And that's probably because there's going to be a number of differing views in respect of that consultation, particularly with regards to the differing communities that are represented here. So there is a further recommendation for your consideration that relevant portfolio holders, council portfolio holders across the force area are recommended to respond to the consultation before the 23rd of August. So those are the 2 recommendations, Chair.
Thank you, Ross. And before I throw those recommendations open to the committee, I would like to formally propose those recommendations as Chair. Vice Chair, seconded. Thank you very much. Committee, is there any reflections on those recommendations or input? Councillor Lever.
Thank you, Chair. And I do struggle to hear when the mics aren't really close to people, so thank you for that. With regard to delegating this to relevant portfolio holders in the councils, if we do not have a particular portfolio holder or councillor who has responsibility for this in our district council, could we find a form of words that suggests it goes to whichever executive committee or cabinet or whatever actually is the senior committee in that authority? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think we can make some amendments to that recommendation to reflect the differing governance structures which are at operation across the Southwest.
Thank you. Councillor White.
Thank you. Just on that point, please could I ask you to use the word relevant elected member, perhaps rather than cabinet, because most of us won't have another cabinet or council meeting before the close date of the consultation. So could you leave it up to us perhaps to decide who is relevant?
Indeed, and of course it's a recommendation from this panel which does not need to be followed. Thank you, Councillor Wright.
Thank you. As the proposer, I'm quite happy to accept those suggestions on board, Vice Chair. Thank you. All in favour? Thank you. I think that was unanimous, wasn't it? Yes. Thank you. Now we move on to item 8, which of course is equally important, is the community recovery. This section is going to be, first of all, led through by the Commissioner. Okay, right, thank you. So, Commissioner, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, and I'm delighted to welcome the University of Plymouth here today with you to be able to give a presentation about the level of efforts and coordinated activity that took place to help the community recover. I would like to just say that some of the key things that we were focused on in that recovery is to restore feelings of safety by those directly affected and the local community, to mitigate future and existing harm that had been caused, particularly by those that may have witnessed or heard or knew people that were affected, and to advance community action through the investment of activities and support for the community so that it would be there beyond an initial period. So we've had quite a bit, as you can see in the report, of funding from various channels to support the community. One in particular from the Home Office, which was to support a community policing team for Keyham. I think the neighbourhood policing team have been, I would say, delighted to have the focus on a small community and be able to give the reassurance that they'd like to do normally throughout the whole of Devon and Cornwall. There was extra funding awarded from the Ministry of Justice for victim support to ensure that we could help people. And if you recall, there were over 300 people that we were helping through that service at one point. And then there was some extra funding from different funding streams that we've managed to secure to support work moving forward. So I'm going to hand over, because the University of Plymouth have done an evaluation of a lot of what's gone on. And I know they're keen to share that with you. So could I hand over to those? We've got Dr. Katie McBride, Caroline Watson, and Professor Zoe James with us today.
Hello, thank you. So we would like to present to you today the findings from our independent evaluation. Our report is available in full, and obviously we can only go over the findings briefly today, but we welcome doing that, and we welcome any questions. We will be whipping through the findings somewhat, but yeah, please see the full report if you would like to know more detail. So we are setting out the findings of the independent evaluation of the Home Office funded community policing and community safety activities and the Ministry of Justice funded victim support activities that occurred in Keyham and the surrounding areas following the critical incident of the 12th of August 2021. The evaluation was funded for a 12-month period by the Home Office's Keyham Community Policing Grant via the Office of the Police and Crime Commission. The research team, which are ourselves plus our colleague Dr. Daniel Gilling, undertook the research, or we were appointed to undertake the independent research in April 2022. And through the Devon and Cornwall Serious Violence Prevention Partnership, additional funding was provided for a full-time PhD student to continue research work for a further 2 years beyond the initial 12-month period. And Caroline Watson, who's sitting next to me, is our PhD student who's continuing the evaluation work. So what we're presenting to you today is the first year of our evaluation, but originally this research was always intended to take a long view. So as we say, we were funded to complete this evaluation to assess and understand whether the Safer Keyham and Keyham Community Policing grants had effectively restored feelings of safety through a range of initiatives, including target hardening, high visibility policing, problem-solving approaches, and extensive community engagement. They were intended to mitigate future and existing harm through community policing and safer street style initiatives. And they were intended to advance community action through investment in empowerment and skills-based engagement, enhanced youth provision and citizen consultations. In addition, the Ministry of Justice funding was provided for victim support services, including additional caseworkers for victim support, Young Devon and Jeremiah's Journey, with extra capacity within Victim Support's 24/7 support helpline.
So I'm just going to quickly run through the aims of our evaluation. So firstly, to provide an evidence base for responding to a mass shooting from a community policing, community safety and victim support perspective. Secondly, to take a trauma-informed research approach to ensure a robust and rigorous evaluation that will effectively identify local lessons and provide national learning. And thirdly, to develop an evidence-based menu of interventions that could inform future community and victim support responses to similar critical incidents. And we also came up with some research questions to address, which was, has the neighbourhood policing approach in Keyham, including sustained community engagement and consultation as a restorative and preventative measure taken following the incident, helped to restore community trust and confidence? Have the funded community safety interventions, so strengthening the local environment, targeted crime prevention and assisting the community to reclaim community spaces in Keyham, had any statistically significant impact on crime and antisocial behaviour levels and community feelings of safety, resilience and recovery? What impact has victim support's role and services had upon aiding individuals and the community in Keyham to recover from the trauma they've experienced? Which approaches or interventions have demonstrated the greatest evidence-based impact to aid the recovery of the community in Keyham and feelings of safety? And finally, which approaches or interventions, if any, have negatively impacted the recovery of the community in Keyham and feelings of safety? And again, briefly, just to run through our the methodology. So our final report, which as Zoe said is available online, draws upon findings from an analysis of secondary data gathered from partners in the Safer Keyham recovery programme, as well as an analysis of crime and antisocial behaviour data relating to Keyham and the surrounding neighbourhoods. The report also draws upon findings from a range of quantitative and qualitative evaluation instruments, which included a community survey, which was completed by 240 residents of Keyham and the neighbouring areas of Ford, North Prospect and Morristown, which was statistically representative. We carried out interviews with 23 professionals and 16 community members. And we carried out focus groups with professionals and community members, and finally a workshop focus group with young people aged 11 to 18. And finally, just to say, the evaluation received approval from the University of Plymouth Ethics Committee in May 2022, and the research process was informed throughout by a research oversight committee.
I'm not very good at this. I just realised I left my button on, so apologies if I've made an echo. So it's coming back to me now anyway. So I should say, before I begin presenting our findings, we're extremely pleased with the methodology that we utilised and the robust nature of the survey that we did, as well as the comprehensive interviews that we did across the board. We really pounded the pavements across Keyham and the surrounding areas to ensure that we got a broad view of community perceptions, but also we should also note, prior to representing the findings, that we are using to some degree the language of the programmes that were funded, and one of our research findings has been around how language, the power of language and the problematic use of particularly the term recovery, and we'd like that noted with the panel immediately so that you are aware that we use that term purely in the context of the funded activities. Okay, so the first thing we did was we reviewed the crime statistics. We had a look at the statistics over time to understand any change that had occurred. So this is a secondary analysis, effectively, of existing crime data. It should be noted immediately that the neighbourhoods that were considered in this analysis are not high crime neighbourhoods, and therefore relatively small changes in the numbers of crimes committed can affect apparently sizable changes in trends. So you're talking about very, very small numbers of offences which have a big knock-on effect on the statistics. We did find, however, that crime and antisocial behaviour in Keyham have generally both fallen in the period since the introduction of the Safer Keyham Recovery Programme. And when judged by the criterion of police recorded crime and antisocial behaviour incidents, Keyham may be considered to have become a safer place in the last year or so. While the limitations of recorded crime as a valid indicator of true crime levels should be acknowledged, it's reasonable to speculate that the introduction of the well-resourced Keyham Community Policing Team might have encouraged a higher rate of crime reporting. The fact that overall recorded crime has not increased gives added confidence to the suggestion that Keyham is a safer place when judged in terms of recorded crime levels. The comparison with bordering neighbourhoods does not provide any evidence of geographical displacement to neighbouring areas, although its possibility cannot be entirely discounted. So moving on to the community survey data, we found some very clear findings. So we found that 59% of people who responded to the survey were aware of a dedicated Keyham policing team that had been formed following the critical incident. 79% of people felt that their community policing was valuable for the area's recovery, and 54% felt that this initiative had had a positive impact on the community overall. 45% of people had had some form of contact with the police in the 12 months following the critical incident. Our research found that any kind of contact with the police improved perception ratings comparable to no contact with the police. That's really interesting because we would normally expect perceptions to drop following contact with the police. However, it is important to note that the overall confidence score and scores for police treatment and community connectedness were higher in the Keyham specific results compared with the results for the wider area, and that's something we'll come back to in a moment. However, it should be noted that overall confidence scores for the Keyham specific results and those for the wider area did not exceed either the regional or national scores. And some interview participants observed that seeing more police in their area over a long period of time might have the potential of increasing the fear of crime. We have presented testimonies of residents and professionals' voices within this presentation, and they are present throughout the report. I'm not going to go over them all now because we don't have time to do so, but you can see some of the responses there.
So in relation to the engagement of young people in the area, the first thing to note is that due in part to the timing of the critical incident which took place in the school holidays, it was clear throughout the research with both professionals and the young people themselves that engagement was challenging. The critical incident and the subsequent news and social media coverage specifically of the events impacted young people and their families in terms of increasing their anxieties and fear associated with public spaces, including parks in particular. And this had the effect of young people either choosing not to leave their homes or their parents actively discouraging them from doing so out of fear for their children's safety. So what we did find, though, is that groups and activities that predated the incident did continue to be places of trust and safety and support for young people. And once the school term had resumed, the information and support that was provided through those school environments was viewed positively. Our research found similar needs as was found by the consultations that took place with young people throughout the course of the Safer Keyham programme, in that young people highlighted the need for more suitable spaces and activities in their local area more broadly. Young people were generally unaware of any new initiatives or clubs that were introduced as a result of their contribution to that consultation in the area, which suggested there's a potential gap in terms of how young people were kept informed of anything that took place as a result of their suggestions that were put forward during that period. In terms of community engagement, 49% of the survey respondents were aware of the Safer Keyham programme. 46% were aware, for example, of the Plymouth Together website, which was set up shortly after the critical incident. Awareness of other activities that had been initiated in the local area, such as the Plymouth Together Community Hub, the Community Voices, was slightly lower among survey respondents, but this is perhaps unsurprising given that new or different approaches may not be immediately grasped across the local community area. Our research found that the Safer Community programme was designed to ensure that existing services, partnerships and networks were embedded into those new initiatives, and the programme did take account of key facilitators to community engagement, highlighted by the academic research, including use of clear goals in its design and implementation, the importance of investment of time, effort and resources, and its use of dedicated staff. The programme identified existing community spaces and multiple forms of advertisement and familiar environments to create opportunities for engagement where they already existed. In the 12 months following the critical incident, 67% of survey respondents had noticed consultations and/or improvements to the public spaces around them. For example, the improvements to green spaces and improved street lighting in the Keyham area specifically. A much larger 89% thought that making public space improvements in principle was a valuable contribution to the area's recovery. 55% felt that this initiative had had a positive impact on the community overall. And what we noted was that positive perceptions of community impact were higher among those who had noticed the improvements to public spaces compared to those who had not noticed the improvements. However, it should also be noted that crime prevention through environmental design alone cannot ameliorate the underlying issues faced by urban communities impacted by austerity, nor individual trauma experienced as a consequence of the critical incident itself, and therefore these extraneous and personal matters may explain the lack of impact for some people these improvements to public spaces made. 18% of survey respondents had engaged with the Feel Safe scheme, which included 11% having received free of charge home security improvements, 7% had obtained personal safety devices, all within the 12 months that followed the critical incident. 78%, a much larger number, thought that the scheme in principle was valuable for the area's recovery, and 43% felt that this initiative had had a positive impact on the community overall. Positive perceptions of the community impact were higher amongst those who had received those free of charge offers as part of the scheme compared with those who'd not. And it was also apparent that some residents had lived without robust home security measures for several years prior to the critical incident. So the Feel Safe scheme demonstrates how interventions put in place in response to the critical incident were also fulfilling previous unmet need in vulnerable people's households in the local area. In relation to the community training that was offered as part of the response package, just 2% of survey respondents had attended the free community training sessions that were offered. Much larger, 72%, again thought that in principle the concept of community training was valuable for the area's recovery, and a third, 33%, felt that this initiative had had a positive impact on the community overall. The professionals that we spoke to highlighted how compliance with the grant funding deadline presented particular challenges to the delivery of an effective training programme to communities at this time. And other barriers to engagement included the ongoing impact of COVID-19 on in-person gatherings and possible uncertainty among community members about the purpose of the training sessions, particularly those on the subject of restorative justice. Ongoing work around embedding trauma-informed practices in the community was driven by members of the Plymouth Trauma-Informed Network, which highlights the role that individuals can play in progressing initiatives so that they become embedded in the local area. The Community Sparks Grants Scheme. 18% of survey respondents had engaged with elements of the Community Sparks Grants Scheme. So, for example, 3% had applied to Sparks for funding, 2% had received Sparks funding, and 9% had participated in voting for a project to receive funding. 72% thought that the scheme in principle was a valuable contribution to the area's recovery, and 34% felt the initiative specifically had had a positive impact on the community overall. Community members and professionals that were interviewed as part of the evaluation were generally positive about the impact of the scheme, particularly those who had engaged with it in some way. However, a small number of interviewees perceived a potential for the participatory voting system to foster competition between projects, particularly for the larger grants, which could have had a negative impact on the resilience of those individuals who received fewer votes and thus losing out on funding.
So, moving on to the victim support findings. We found that of those people surveyed, 6% had used victim support services in the 12 months following the critical incident. 85% of people thought that the victim support service was valuable for the area's recovery, and 49% felt that victim support had had a positive impact on the community overall. In accordance with this evaluation's trauma-informed approach, it was decided that requesting direct contact with individuals who had received support from victim support would not be appropriate in this piece of work. Interviews with community members, however, identified that although many acknowledged the deeply tragic nature of the critical incident, they did not feel closely connected to it and did not perceive themselves necessarily as victims in need of support. Our research found that victim support's approach of carrying out extensive engagement work within and beyond KIAM and ensuring their support offer was available to anyone affected by crime and not limited to those impacted by the critical incident ensured that there was no wrong door to support for those who would benefit from it. Interviews with victim support professionals highlighted a clear intention for support to be available and accessible in the years following the critical incident for any individuals who require it. So that's a very quick summary of our core findings, and we have put together a simple table here of our concluding points for you that orient around these 4 areas of neighbourhood policing, victim support, community safety interventions, and the impact of approaches and interventions. But what we'd really like to do is move on to our key learning points that we feel are really important to be noted. And they are, as we previously said, embedded within this longer 3-year project. So it's important that we realise that it's appreciated that this is that first year of the independent evaluation. Our key learning points, therefore, are preliminary, but we would like to make them very clearly. So first of all, we feel that funding awards should be long-term, sustainable and flexible in order to be responsive to the community's needs following a critical incident such as this. Existing community infrastructures should be utilised and resourced to facilitate community engagement and consultation, and over-reliance on volunteers in the delivery of initiatives should be acknowledged alongside the recognition that they may not work within the same parameters as statutory agencies. Pre-existing need in areas impacted by a critical incident should be taken account of in delivering services to ameliorate rather than exacerbate community tensions. Proactive deployment of a dedicated community policing team provides a coherent distance between initial response and investigation teams and recovery work. Sustained engagement of community police officers in partnership with community organisations contributes to the building of trust and confidence in communities. Provision of effective long-term support to communities and professionals working in the area after a critical incident should take account of needs that arise from associated anniversaries and coronial inquests. A dedicated communications lead should oversee the production of publications and ensure consistency of language across print and digital media to negate use of language and terminology that may exacerbate trauma. The distribution of hard copy information and support leaflets for residents, in addition to social media posts, ensures a broader reach across the community. The impact of critical incidents on young people should be a prominent focus of the recovery process, particularly given the potential for their exposure to disturbing narratives and images on social media. The provision of resources and interventions to specific, predefined geographical areas risks excluding those impacted from equidistant, adjacent, and other areas. Support offers should extend beyond the immediate area of the critical incident and be made available to professionals and volunteers involved in the recovery process. So those are the key learning points, and that is a summary of our project, which is available via the Plymouth Together website, but placed on the university system. As this is an independent study, it's therefore important that it is cited in that space. We welcome your questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and it certainly brings a lot of complicated issues together, so thank you for covering that today. Councillor Penberthy.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a number of different areas I'd like to pick up. I don't know whether you want me to do them sort of one at a time, or just to go through them and let people respond then to whichever bits they feel are appropriate.
If you'd like to, you've got the time and the space to go through them separately, if you like, Councillor.
Okay, thank you. So where do I begin? I think first of all, I'd just like to say, for those who don't know it, you might think Keyham is urban, but think about a village like Horrobridge or Ermington or Millbrook, and you're probably a bit bigger than Keyham. If you think about Keyham, Ford, Morristown and North Prospect, you're thinking of a community of around the 10,000 mark. Can you imagine in your communities, especially those in rural areas, the impact of 5 deaths? And whether you would then be talking about, we're now at a point where the research is continuing, but the support package is finishing. And I think I just wanted to put that in front of the comments I make, because in a trauma-informed city, we know that trauma doesn't stop, but we also know that funding programs do. And what we're talking about is a community experiencing trauma where the funding programs are stopping. And that's not a criticism of the police or the council, because actually this is some external funding, and quite often we all know government says, I've chucked some money at it for a year and the problem's solved. And I think we need to be thinking about that context when we think about this report, given that this is the start of an ongoing series where in the future there will be less resource available to support the people of Keyham, Ford, Morristown and North Prospect. And so picking up on that, I think it is important for us to have a better understanding of the services that are there now that won't be there or are already being withdrawn. So what will be the impact of children and young people if Jeremiah's Journey are having to seek charitable funding to continue their support in this area? Because the loss of a loved one doesn't necessarily be overcome quickly. And as a military city, we know that a loss of a loved one in a violent issue for children can lead to longer-term PTSD and CPTSD. That isn't resolved in a 12 or 24-month period. So I think there are some issues here around the response, because we're looking at a response now, that need to be addressed. And certainly when young people were talking about not being sure, not knowing about what was going on, that is especially important, because young people were out and about and probably disproportionately impacted on the day of the shootings. So I think that's a bit of sort of context that I just wanted to put in. Obviously we only have two members of the panel, we're both here. I would like to acknowledge, for those who won't be aware but watching, that Councillor Mark Coker, one of the local councillors, is sitting in the gallery, and please excuse me, he has been feeding me some comments during the presentation. I've just made my comments. I'm now going to feed in, if that's all right, Chair, Councillor Coker's perceptions as a ward councillor.
Yes, under the circumstances, Councillor, I think that would be appropriate, and especially, I believe the councillor was a substitute last time, and unfortunately the meeting was cancelled. So, yes, I think that's appropriate for today.
Thank you. So the first of those, it's great to see such a high level of awareness of the KCPT. You know, in most areas, I don't think our communities would have a 60% awareness of our community policing team. It would be interesting to know what it was before in Keyham. And once the police are not able to continue that large level of resource, where it goes back to. But what's interesting is that on page 28 of the report, it does talk about, or page 28 of our report pack, it does talk about the confidence not having been raised above regional and national levels. Despite that, additional resource and increased knowledge. And I do wonder what needs to happen to raise confidence in policing if you're putting in a lot more and it not changing, and that isn't really answered in that. And I don't know if that's because it's not within the scope of the research, or whether it's because we need some more work to understand why it is that additional investment in community policing isn't leading to increased confidence in policing. Because I think that is an important issue. I think that we can learn from this as we go forward. I have been asked explicitly to talk about the fact that the broader reach mentioned in the learning is something that is deemed as critical by local councillors and felt at times wasn't really there, and that broader reach beyond communities is really important in trying to help communities resolve trauma. And a question about how the operation as a whole worked with other partners that might have been more individuals or very small community groups. So, for example, local councillors, local neighbourhood watch, some of those very small groups and individuals representing, because to them, and I haven't only heard this from Mark, it felt really difficult at times. I think being a small fish in a large organisational pond where the organisations were doing things, and actually it felt therefore that some of the local stuff was being more done to rather than being done with. And I think that I've reflected on what Councillor Coker has fed back to me. So I don't know how that can be responded to, because in some way it is reflection. But Chair, thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you, Councillor. And I'll ask the Commissioner to respond.
there may be some issues that the University of Plymouth want to respond on, and I'll just mention a few. I suppose, firstly, in response to this whole incident and how we got in extra funding, what was interesting is that we had to identify existing funding streams that were available to pull that funding down. So we were quite restricted. We didn't say, could we have a recovery fund, government? We had to identify existing pots of funding that were available and pull that down. So if you think about it like that, we didn't say, this is what we think we need for recovery. We basically said, right, what is available where we can put in some sort of proposal of what would help Keyham to be able to access those funding streams. So I think that was quite a tricky, it was the fastest way. It was the fastest way to get money down to support the community than it was trying to build up a case for a year or two to get government to support it. So I think that's quite important to understand. And of course, all of those funding streams that we actually did get into are time-limited funding streams. So we sort of knew what we were getting into when we were requesting it. So it's a bit of a challenge that we're trying to think about, what does that exit strategy look like in relation to funding and support for that community as we move forward. Just in terms of the glide path out of Keyham with those funding streams and what the plan is, one of the things that I've promised, and I work very closely with the local MP and ward councillors for the area around reopening, I was going to say reopening, but it's never been open, Devonport Police Station. This city will now have 3 police inquiry offices. Exeter has 1. Truro has 1 in a council building. This city's going to have 3 dedicated police offices for the public to be able to access, and that will be reopened. Sorry, I keep saying reopened because I'm reopening all ones that closed. I'm opening for the first time Devonport Police Station to the public, and that will be open by September. So some members were with me only last week visiting and seeing how that work is getting on in Devonport Station. So we've tried to think of some legacy things that we could do to support the city following what's happened. The second thing I'd just like to say is that the project manager for a lot of this was actually seconded from my office to come and work down in Plymouth and alongside partners. And both that person and the Serious Violence Prevention Programme director and some of the university team all went to the Home Office on Wednesday, the 5th of July, to share and disseminate these learnings with them. And I thought that's a really critical element of helping everybody understand what we know. And it's also been shared with leaders across the system, across the city and beyond, in terms of their learning, with a Q&A session that happened in terms of picking out what's happened in the evaluation. So there's been already a dissemination of some of the learnings out of here. One little point that I'd just like to add, Councillor, is interestingly one of the smallest, I will say, organisations in Keyham that actually rang me on the morning after the incident when I was down in Plymouth was Neighbourhood Watch. And so it's some of the smallest organisations that are the most in touch and wanted to do something, and the Feel Safe scheme was funded by my office within 24 hours to be able to help that tiny organisation be able to actually do something and act quickly. So sometimes it's a beautiful thing to be small. It's just the challenge that we had, and I remember being at some of those meetings, Councillor, where the organisations were trying to be active, and there were more organisations that were public or statutory that had the energy, the time and the effort to do it than those who were trying to lead smaller organisations. And that was a difficulty at the beginning. But that's just a few comments from me, but I don't know if there's any that the university might want to respond to.
Would anybody like to come in on that?
Yeah. Okay, so I'd just like to follow up on a few things to maybe expand for the panel some of the issues that have been raised. And I thought that Councillor Pemberley noting the areas impacted by this incident was really important. And in your list of areas impacted were Ford, Keyham, North Prospect and Morristown. And I think one of the important things that we've raised is about geography and is about the labelling of geographical spaces. Our findings are very clear that the area where funding was most targeted, around Keyham and Ford, we see improvements, but we don't see those improvements in North Prospect and in Morristown. And particularly North Prospect, we need to think about, for those people who don't know Plymouth, the geography of the city and the fact that North Prospect was overlooking physically the area. So the bounded nature of how some of the funding was delivered was problematic in our view and is evidenced through the findings of the research. So I think it's really important that we keep raising that and that this wasn't about Keyham, this was about a broader area. We also note in the report that many pre-existing issues in areas impacted some of the outcomes, as we've mentioned, going forward. And so it is really difficult to extrapolate those issues from the issues that were faced by the trauma within the community. And that's why the piece of work that's continuing is so important, so that we can look at what's going on across the area going forward. And we have been commissioned by the Police and Crime Commissioner to do an additional survey in the area later in the year so that we can see how people are doing and see what people's needs are. But also the intention is to make sure that that survey is replicable elsewhere so that we can actually offer that as a resource to other areas, God forbid that a similar incident should happen elsewhere, so that people can assess community feelings of safety. Sorry, I'm just looking down at my list. I think it's important that you raise the point around public confidence. So there is evidence of public confidence in policing rising in the area of particularly Keyham and Ford. And as you note, the failure to reach regional or national levels. But there is a rise in those local areas. So, you know, that needs to be considered in relative terms, which is important. The point about the geographical areas is emphasised also in what you're saying about broader reach. And we felt, and we've pointed out in the research, that victim support evidenced good practice in the way that they provided support across the region, because obviously people were travelling through Plymouth that day, maybe stopped at the shops on the way home, but also many people who work in the area or who go to school in other areas were travelling through, etc., or travel in and out of that specific geography. The other thing I wanted to just respond to was about the issues of any tensions between organisations. I think because of the way that funding functions, and as the Police and Crime Commissioner said, we did raise with the Home Office the necessity for funding to be available in a far more immediate and coherent fashion rather than in a piecemeal fashion following an incident such as this. And we did try and represent the breadth of voices across the community and across professionals, voluntary sector, third sector, etc. So those voices are hopefully represented within the report. And while, yes, there are tensions always in circumstances such as this, and sometimes to some degree, the work in the area can become something of an industry while the community itself is getting on with their day-to-day lives. That's also important to note, and thinking about that in terms of sustainability, and Caroline will be exploring that further going forward with her research. So I don't know if I've kind of responded to everything that you were raising there, but hopefully some of those things. Oh, young people, Katie, do you want to?
I just wanted to, again, follow up on your point around the young people, and you're quite right that the legacy for young people is yet to be seen, and that, you know, on the back of an underpinning issue that they and professionals and others that we spoke to raised of a deficit already in support, places, spaces for young people, that this incident then occurred on top of, it tied in with the timing of the incident and the lack of, you know, the statutory schooling system to be the route through which to access those young people. You know, we can all kind of agree that it shouldn't be the case that just because it happened when it happened, that those access points for young people aren't there, and that will have had an impact that will hopefully pick up over the next few years through Caroline's work, but it will undoubtedly go beyond that.
Thank you. Councillor Pengelly.
I think you mean Penberthy. Sadly, Councillor Pengelly is no longer with us.
Apologies.
Thanks for that. I think it's all really helpful. Just in terms of the small groups, what I was trying to say was about feeling done to rather than done with, and what that could mean for building trust and confidence. The more you do with, the more you build trust and confidence. And having heard some feedback about feeling more done to and the difficulties, because of the differences, and we can all understand that, it was just a sort of reflection in terms of some of the additional learning that we might want to think about in terms of power dynamics, should awfully this ever happen again, but also if ever we're doing targeted work in areas, the issues of power dynamics and timings and understandings. Well, we can chuck paid staff at things, but communities might need a bit more time, and we might need to work at community spaces and paces and so on. And sadly, Home Office funding regimes quite often mean that you've got a year, and actually what you need is 3, 4 and 5, and it might not be that we need more money, but actually what we need is the money being able to be spent in different ways with much more community leadership. And I think that's probably a lesson that governments of all colours could learn. It's not about this year's budget, get it out the way, we've ticked that box. In quite a lot of the times when they're responding in what for them are sort of rounding error figures, it's actually a very different feel on the ground, and it would maybe be good for that to be explored a bit more, and for some of those voices to come back in terms of, if we'd had that 220, 230 odd thousand pounds over 5 years, we might have asked to work differently in order to be able to do this for our longer term recovery, and that might have helped to bring in some of the other areas. So it wasn't a per se criticism, it was more a reflection on what Mark was feeding to me and others have fed to me about how it's felt. I'm the cabinet member with responsibility for communities and community cohesion, so I've been picking up some of the sort of slightly more peripheral bits on it rather than the actual incident bit. But thank you for all of your responses, and I'm sure that will be appreciated by those who will be watching this either live or later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Lever.
Thank you, Chair. Gosh, what an amazing piece of work that you've been doing. Thank you so much for that. Fascinating. I have so many questions, I almost don't know where to begin. So I think, along with Councillor Penberthy, I think I'd like to start with a little bit of a reflection about what I'm hearing. I'm new to this panel, so I don't have a history of knowing the details of what happened, but clearly it was a deeply traumatic incident that has had and will continue to have impacts on the members of the community and more broadly for some time. I suppose I go back to working in South Yorkshire in communities that were affected about some of the difficult incidents that happened around the miners' strike, which feels like about 500 years ago, but actually isn't that long ago. And I worked on just to give a little context, and it is relevant, and I will come to questions. I worked funded by a government programme, the Single Regeneration Budget, which was 30 years ago. And it was very much about community resilience, and I was very pleased to hear the words community cohesion being mentioned over there, because this feels to me as though a lot of the findings of the research that you've done, the impact assessment, actually reading it, it was like, gosh, this feels like I've read this before, because there are some really clear messages that come out of this for me. One of them is the funding, the longer term, flexible funding to meet local needs. This is no surprise. This is completely no surprise. I also sit on one of the boards of the local government association, where we look at things like regeneration funding. Across the board, local authorities are saying, do you know what? Short-term funding, actually putting lots of effort into trying to draw down bits and pieces of money to fit in with particular funding programs, is an industry in itself, and it doesn't necessarily result in the best outcomes locally. So I think that, for me, is fascinating that you've come up with that as well. I was particularly struck by looking at your key learning points that you mentioned there's an over-reliance on volunteers, and by the sounds of it, that there are a number of services which are coming to at the end of their funded period, and that, I don't know if I've picked this up correctly, and that volunteers are effectively going to be asked to carry on a service which has been a paid-for service. I don't know. But I'd be interested in your thoughts just on that side of things. But also, gosh, I could talk for ages on this, but I'm not going to. The other particular thing I'm very, very interested in is looking about how your findings, when you were doing the surveys, we were presented with the figures for people's responses to the questions across the board, and I suppose I'm particularly interested to see the difference between the wider population and young people within the community. Fabulous that you're doing longer term assessment to sort of see what will happen. I'm also really interested to see, you know, how long that goes on for, because as was mentioned previously, a trauma-informed approach understands, as clearly I think people in this room appear to, that trauma doesn't happen, and that, you know, and it impacts for a long time. So I'd be interested in, does this have an impact on those wider outcomes for particularly young people in this community around health outcomes, educational outcomes, all of those sorts of things. And I suppose my question, I will come to a question, which is about, is it possible that the austerity that all local authorities operate under, and the difficulties that local authorities have, and particularly in this instance perhaps Plymouth City Council has, in providing those broader community-based services as standard, has perhaps made life more difficult for this community? And I don't know if you're able to answer that sort of question. Thank you.
Okay, so there's lots of things to respond to there. Thank you. So I think initially what I would say is that one of the advantages of employing an academic team of criminologists to do this work is that we understand how the criminal justice sector functions, how crime and antisocial behaviour occurs, but also issues of social inclusion and exclusion more broadly. So our academic team is made up of, obviously Caroline is our PhD student with a criminology master's, but Katie has expertise in issues around community cohesion. Daniel Gilling is an expert in community safety, and I like to think I'm an expert in lots of things. No, I'm an expert around inclusion and policing and community safety to some degree. So there is a real advantage to having a team of people who have that embedded historic knowledge to bring to the table in this study. And I think that's actually really important, because evaluation research doesn't necessarily always function like that. It can be very shallow. whereas I do lots of evaluation work, and I like to think it is able to reflect on deeper issues, wider contextual matters, etc., which can then inform good practice. So when you talk about repeated cycles, that's absolutely, I appreciate those cycles as well, as do we as a team, and we reflect on those in the report, and we try to understand them better. So I think it's excellent practice that we were commissioned to do it, obviously. But also that there is a long-term view with this study, because as you say, the trauma doesn't go away. And we're not able to look at the long-term outcomes for young people impacted by this specific traumatic event. But what we are able to do is to look at community cohesion overall, the impact of events such as these, both locally, nationally and internationally, and as a piece of Caroline's work will be around that. It's very difficult for a single PhD to cover so much, but she's currently endeavouring to sort of plan that out and understand how we can best utilise the findings of this research to impact future good practice. So I'm cautious about making promises about big responses more broadly. One of the things that I would say around funding is that the virtuous agreement between victim support and the Police and Crime Commission means that there is a long-term relationship, which means that victim support are able to engage in activities, be very responsive across the whole area of Devon and Cornwall, rather than having to fund for, request piecemeal pieces of funding, which we know is problematic across the board generally for especially smaller and mid-range size organisations who can spend a huge amount of resource and time actually applying for funding rather than completing work. So that is a really good another piece of good practice, I think.
Councillor Toms, I think, was next.
Thank you. It's always good to get a set of independent eyes and a fresh look at anything that comes up. A couple of things from me. One is the deprivation. Plymouth has quite a high deprivation rate. For every one that's in the 50% at least deprived, there's 2 in the most deprived. So, it makes a difference. Exactly the same in Cornwall, believe it or not. And the other thing is that looking at the deprivation, it's got a slightly lower crime rate than other parts of Plymouth, on average. So, that's a good thing. And like Councillor Benberthy or Councillor, I can't remember, Chris.
Just think of cousin Denzel.
Chris, what I'm trying to say is that, it's got that community feel. You usually get a lower crime rate in places which have that community feel. But I'd like to see if there was any recommendation coming out of this, that maybe in 2 years or maybe 3 years' time, you do a similar acid test on the area so that you'll see whether it's gone up, gone down, or stayed the same. Because I think that, like people have said, the funding will drop out, and then where's it gonna go? And have that knowledge of where it actually went will be invaluable to, other people when they have incidents of the same. Okay, thank you.
So the Police and Crime Commissioner has funded a second community survey that will be carried out in exactly the same format as the first, or largely the same format as the first one, to reflect the different funded areas from that first year to see how the community is faring in the second year. Beyond that, we will see if that's commissioned again or if further work's commissioned to look at crime rates and crime patterns across the area, looking at local crime rates comparative to regional and national crime rates is kind of the job of the criminologist. We do that all the time. There's a funded piece of work currently going on looking at a particular area, another area of Plymouth that was commissioned by the Race Equality Council, which will be interesting when their findings come out. It's another area of Plymouth that they're focusing on. So we will be able to tell you more in a year's time. And likewise, Caroline will continue in this area. But yeah, we're always happy to do more work to understand.
Thank you. Councillor Hewing and then Councillor Thomas.
Hello, I would like to thank you for this report. I especially found people's comments that you've put in on the following page has actually almost been more interesting and revealing than some of your comments. I'd particularly like to focus on young people, because that is my bent. I was a bit saddened about the young people not knowing of new initiatives, because that should have been going out in school newsletters and using the schools to help communicate the messages through the primary schools, and the realisation that, you know, the children that go to Keyham don't necessarily come from Keyham. So, and children from Keyham may go to other schools as well. It's a big city. There's a lot of choice. There's grammar schools, church schools, and state schools, etc., academies. So it's probably working a bit further afield than you may have thought about. With some of the funding and seeing about the clubs and things, mainly the new initiatives and clubs introduced, are they sustainable? You know, or are they part of this limited funding package? To me, I would have liked to have seen skate parks, BMX trails parks, things like that. Adults and children both use skate parks, BMX trails. You'll find older children teach younger ones how to do the skating and things like that. It's, in Tavistock, I call it Youth Corner, because the youth cafe is just up the road. You've got the skate park, the BMX trails, they're all together. And actually for the police, it's a complete blessing, because you always know where to find everybody. So, you know, and for those, they're tangibles. And they're also, you know, not going to need more funding for a very long time. You know, maintenance, usually graffiti, I have to be honest. And, you know, it's very sort of low maintenance. And they're things that are going to be there for a very long time. Whereas some of these other initiatives has already been, you know, commented on. They may be more short term. And I think, you know, that would be really great if that could be done. It is unfortunate that everything happens in the school holidays, because children where they would normally congregate and talk to each other, that wasn't there for a couple of weeks. Well, most of the holidays. So that was the difficulty. And I think where some of the young people have said about things on social media and things like that, because they weren't actually seeing each other for some of them. You know, some may live the other side of Plymouth, for example, and the area was cut off for quite a few weeks, that Keyham was just cut off a bit from the world, and people not leaving their homes, and, you know, especially where you've got police cars there every day, the tape up, that does have an impact. And the mental health of young people, there may be an incident on the news that's very similar, you know, for example, in Liverpool, with the young girl that was shot mistakenly, but that will have caused a fear because that crime went through a house. And those sort of things could be trigger points that it may be worth you looking at with some of the people who focus on this sort of thing, that actually just to put into schools, so whoever's dealing with mental health, etc., in the schools for Plymouth City Council knows what might cause a trigger. Because as we all know, for example, with domestic violence, you know, the young person can go to school the next day, and until we had the MASH and the MARAC, etc., a school didn't know that a child had been through a really rough night the night before, and they've come to school and they've kicked off in school, and nobody knows why. And, you know, I'm very proud that I helped introduce MASH and the MARAC. I've also been part of the process in my life, and it is very good, but they need to be staying there. So that is where, you know, my question is, can there be things put in that are tangible and that stay there, as opposed to some clubs which could just fall away?
Commissioner?
Councillor, this evaluation is about the safer aspect in relation to the funding that was achieved through my office, and relates to a lot to policing, victim support. It doesn't relate all to the infrastructure of the community, the council's response. Any of those elements is not fully covered in this report. So just straying into slightly different territory. In terms of that particular report, that would be something that I would be expecting from Plymouth City Council in terms of how they've done it. I mean, this is very much so that you're able to scrutinise my efforts in relation to what we did in terms of the recovery. I mean, there are some infrastructure changes that have happened through the safety funding, because we got Safer Streets money for it, so that includes street lighting, things that were actually infrastructure improvements, but it wasn't there to fund a skate park, it wasn't there to fund those sorts of things, the money that I managed to achieve with working with partners to pull down from the government. So I'm afraid I can't fully answer that question for you today.
Thank you. This is a really, really important topic, so I don't want to rush members, but if we could just keep the questions quite quick fire. I've got one more speaker, one more questioner, sorry, Councillor Thomas, and then I think we're going to have to round up this item. Councillor Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not going to go into the trauma and the support groups and the need for further funding, because I think Councillor Penberthy and Councillor Lever have both dealt with that, and I certainly support what they're saying about long term. Councillor Penberthy, I lived for some years in Ford, you'll be glad to know, and I lived in your ward as well, so I do know the area. But the point you make about Ermington and Shaw Priory, we could equally talk about the other communities of Plymouth in terms of keeping people safe. And so I suppose my question is to the Commissioner, because I look at some of the positives that have come out of this dreadful happening. You know, a dedicated community policing team, young people having conversations about wanting more suitable spaces, improvements to street lighting, improvements to public spaces, robust home security measures added to homes where they're needed. Commissioner, it strikes me that the people of Keyham have had to pay an enormously high price for the sort of policing that you would want to see across the whole of Devon and Cornwall regularly. Can I take it that would be a fair take?
Councillor, the Keyham Community Policing Team is the gold standard of neighbourhood policing, and it is something that we would all wish to have throughout the whole of Devon and Cornwall. The Chief Constable's really clear about investing in neighbourhood policing. I'm awaiting a plan for that investment. There's already been some investment, but even speaking to the Keyham Community Policing Team, who would normally have policed some of the other areas, took a real pleasure in being able to carry out neighbourhood policing as it should be carried out. And I don't feel there's many other teams in the whole of Devon and Cornwall that have been able to do that even since we've had the uplift, because we haven't got all of the people in the organisation yet. So there is an issue, and I have asked the Chief Constable to look at neighbourhood policing from a gold, silver and bronze standard. Is there a universal? We can't all have a Keyham community policing team in the way that we managed to achieve that after such a terrible incident, but can we have levels of it and understand what those levels are and which communities need or require more of those levels? That's still a conversation that was underway. So I completely agree with your, if you like, summary of what this is sort of telling us, really.
Councillor Coad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't doubt the value of this evaluation, and I would like to thank the authors for their efforts in this case. No one, I don't think, could have foreseen the events leading up to this evaluation, if you like. I always thought Keyham had a good community policing prior to the events leading to this point. If I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to take issue with part of the key learning points, and it's possible that I just actually don't understand it. And it's the phrase over-reliance on volunteers. Communities greatly benefit from the volunteer workforce. Not only communities, but also those volunteers themselves benefit from volunteering. Now, if I've misunderstood this, then perhaps somebody, one of the authors may bring me up to speed on what the phrase actually means, over-reliance on volunteers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Who would like to pick that
That's
up?
fine. Thank you. And I think you're making a really important point that volunteering is both valuable to the community that are supported by volunteers, but also valuable for the volunteers themselves. When we talk about an over-reliance on volunteers, what we mean is that there are certain circumstances where volunteers can feel a greater burden than is necessarily appropriate, especially in the case of a serious critical incident. So people may feel overburdened or have multiple needs associated with the burden placed on them in that particular circumstance. So that's what we mean. Not that volunteering isn't a really important and valuable thing for people to do and to experience, but that sometimes we have to be aware of the fact that volunteers are carrying out roles and tasks that may be more appropriately supported by people who have greater time agency and are actually paid to do so. I should point out as well, I think it might be helpful to point out from the previous comment from Councillor Thomas around community policing, that in order for community policing to be truly effective, it requires the buy-in of the officers on the ground. And we see lots of initiatives where community policing is Devon and Cornwall's own brand of policing that we're proud of as a region. And since its inception, but it's not necessarily within forces, given the primacy and the value that it should be, because it's sometimes seen, and we note this in the report, as a role where officers who are going out to grass, so to speak. Whereas in this case, because it was a response to a critical incident, the officers involved saw its value. And that's a really important learning lesson going forward for other community policing initiatives, especially in the wider national discussion of how policing can be there can be greater confidence in policing.
Okay, thank you. Can I thank the
Chairman, may I just add? Sorry, yeah, sure. I think it's important because Councillor Crode makes an important observation, and I think we have to be realistic, because there's the ideal world, and then there's the reality of dealing with what it's like in a crisis and the aftermath of a crisis. And I just thought that actually the appropriate wording, and it wouldn't be what an evaluator would say, is it's the unfortunate reality. In a response to a crisis, everyone feels overburdened, whether you're a volunteer or you're working in the public sector. And you can't not overburden a volunteer in a crisis. Everybody is all hands on deck and everybody is doing everything they can. And I think it's just an unfortunate reality when we're dealing in a crisis. So it's not that we could change the over-reliance on volunteers. They are needed to help get through this. So it's a really interesting observation that Councillor Crode makes, because we wouldn't be the #1 lowest crime rate area in the country if it wasn't for all our volunteers and our communities doing what they do. And we are the #1 right now.
Thank you, Commissioner. I don't think it's about undervaluing volunteers. It's about the proportion and how those resources are deployed, isn't it? So, yeah, thank you.
Change a volunteer is a volunteer who's there. It's just an unfortunate reality.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you to the authors for coming along today and taking us through that presentation. I think it's given the panel an opportunity to get their heads around what is a very complicated and difficult subject. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask the committee to officially note the report. I will propose as chair. Vice chair's seconded. All in favour? Thank you. That's unanimous. Now, moving on, we have a couple of options. I'm conscious of time and we are overrunning. Would the panel like a quick comfort break, say 5 or 10 minutes, and then come back to plough on, and then have lunch after that? Or would we like lunch now and then come back this afternoon? Okay. I'm being told that having lunch now might be difficult. So if we have a 10-minute comfort break, then we'll come back and hopefully I think the pace of this afternoon's agenda may pick up as the business is getting simpler. So see you all in 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, members, to this afternoon's business. I am proposing that item 10 is taken next on the agenda, so I will put that forward as chair, vice chair. Thank you. All in favour, we take item 10 next. Thank you very much. Item 10 is the Commissioner's update report, and I'm going to ask the Commissioner, because I think this is an appropriate place on the agenda, to address the current situation with the Chief Constable's suspension, and we will take questions at the end on that as well. Obviously, there is a live investigation going on, so members will need to be mindful of that. But for now, we'll go forward with item 10. Commissioner, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I have an announcement to make that isn't obviously in the Commissioner's update today, and it's that on the 22nd of July, I took a decision to suspend 26th of July, sorry, I took the decision to suspend the Chief Constable pursuant to Section 38(2) of the Police Reform and Social Responsibility Act 2011. I have suspended the Chief Constable of Devon and Cornwall Police, Will Kerr, following allegations of misconduct, and I have referred the matter to the Independent Office of Police Conduct, who has confirmed that it will commence an investigation. Open to any questions about the process of my suspension, and I appreciate this is not great news for neither the force, neither himself or his family, neither our office. We just hope that these investigations are swift so that an outcome can be resolved. I make no judgment whatsoever on the fact that I've made a suspension on the allegations against him.
Thank you, Commissioner, and that is noted. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Councillor Wright. Oh, right.
Thank you, Chair. My first question, take what you said completely, it's about the process. To understand when you knew about the allegations, did you know during the shortlisting period? I can see by media reports that you knew by April. So my question is, why did it take so long to suspend, if you're able to answer that?
Thank you, Chairman. I can be really clear that in the shortlisting process, I had no awareness of these allegations. They first came to me on the 23rd of March this year, and I was notified by the Police Service of Northern Ireland that a criminal allegation was made about Will Kerr, and I made a referral that evening to the Independent Office of Police Conduct. I did consider suspension at that point. There is a threshold upon which I would make a decision around suspension about the public interest test, and I decided at that point, with the information I had before me, that that was not the time for suspension.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any other questions? No?
And just for your awareness, Councillor Wright, after I submitted that referral to the Independent Office of Police Conduct, it was on the 20th of April that I received a response from the Independent Office of Police Conduct informing me that they were closing, that it wasn't a referral. They did not consider they had jurisdiction over the allegation.
Thank you for placing that on the record, Commissioner. Councillor Lever.
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered what's changed between that period of time and now.
More information has come to light before me on the 17th of July from the Police Ombudsman of Northern Ireland, who has now taken over the investigation. And in relation to that, I submitted a new referral to the Independent Office of Police Conduct, of which they have accepted and instigating an investigation.
Any other questions? Yes, Councillor.
Commissioner, when you said jurisdiction in that first sentence you gave, that meant the jurisdiction of this country when it needed to be Northern Ireland. Is that correct?
the allegations relate to a period before the Chief Constable was in Devon and Cornwall, and there are jurisdictional issues between Northern Ireland and England and Wales, and the differentials between legal frameworks.
Any other questions? Yes, Councillor.
Can you comment further on any of the allegations? I've seen media sources that it's potentially sexual assault.
Thank you, Councillor. The Commissioner cannot comment on any allegations being under the remit of the jurisdiction of the Police Ombudsman of Northern Ireland. Her referral to the IOPC relates to alleged conduct matters, and she is not in a position to comment on the investigations of the Police Ombudsman of Northern Ireland.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's not a question, really. I think it's probably a statement. I think, personally, the Commissioner acted quite appropriately, given the circumstances.
Thank you, Roger. Any other questions? Okay. Commissioner, would you care to return to the report?
Thank you, Chairman. I suppose it's important to add, as no one has asked, that Acting Chief Constable Jim Colwell will be at the reins for a period of time, just so that you're aware. I also wanted to add, because I know we haven't had time and space since our last formal meeting, and it happened, and there was a bit of a discussion from Councillor Penberthy earlier around names, but I just wanted to say how very sad I was to hear of the loss of Councillor Vivian Pengelly. She was a huge champion of policing. To hear of her passing was and she's been a personal mentor and support to me from when I was a very young officer at Plymouth City Council. But she was a huge champion of policing on the police authority, spent many years scrutinising and supporting chief constables and police officers. So I just wanted to say our sincere regret at the loss of Councillor Vivian Pengelly, who we won't see on this panel anymore. Just to add, it's not even a brighter note, because actually I'm going to talk about the Police Bravery Awards. You know, in order to go to the Police Bravery Awards, you've had to have suffered some quite serious incident as a police officer to be able to go and do that. But it is a slightly brighter note, as there has been some recognition of police officers from this force on the national and regional stage. And I would just like to particularly highlight PC Darren Brimacombe and PC Tim Willett, who have been recognised for their bravery in a frenzied knife attack that happened on Dartmoor, and while they were responding to a high-risk missing man. I just wanted to say that these are examples of what police officers are doing nationally every day in our communities, and I just wanted to wish them both well, and really pleased that they went to 10 Downing Street to receive an award as well. I will be out next week, and it's stated in there about the reopening of more police front desks. So I will be out next week, out and about. So I'll go and visit some of the ones that we're about to reopen as well. And we're looking forward to promoting those this year. I'm sure panel, we will make sure, I remember Councillor Chopak asking about Bude. We will make sure panel members will be invited to every single reopening that we do, in case you'd like to join in those celebrations. Just in terms of a couple of other bits to particularly point out, the Councillor Advocates seminar that took place, that's not necessarily in the original report, just to say we focused on road safety. I know panel have been particularly keen to talk about, explore and understand how we are tackling road safety, and we had an excellent attendance at that seminar only the other week, and I think to understand the tasking process in policing and a range of the investments that we've made through Vision Zero has been the most enlightening to many councillors, and particularly our efforts to support and motorcyclists we've had some serious collisions and road deaths from motorcyclists, and we've been spending a lot of effort in trying to target them, in understanding their own behaviour, and for drivers to be thinking about them. I'll leave it there just in terms of a couple of key points to highlight, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. And as Chair, I'd like to thank you for your comments regarding the late Councillor Pengelly as well. Thank you for those words. Are there any questions for the Commissioner? Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. On page 59 of our pack, you talk about Operation Cosset and motorcycle safety. I know that you, like I, receive a lot of emails about exactly this topic. And I just wondered what could be done about the complaints that I get continually, and I know that one of my residents writes to you a lot as well, about the fact that, especially late at night, and it's an urban environment, motorcycles sitting at traffic lights just revving their engines. By the time you can't get any details before they've gone, so it's just one of these bits. It's going on till 4 or 5 in the morning. We had an apology yesterday from a motorcyclist publicly who had been doing stupid things and caused an accident. I've watched motorcyclists wheeling down Exeter Street and all sorts of other things. There seem to be quite a lot of moving vehicle offences related to motorbikes, the way they use the roads and also the level of their exhausts. Well, it's great something's going on. It's been a bane of some people's lives for years. And I know it's not just in my community that happens. When we've talked about it before, it's come up from across the region. Is there anything that can be done? Because it's really difficult for the public to report what's going on. But we must know there are hotspots. We all know there are hotspots. It would be really good to see that particular level of ASB caused by a moving vehicle offence being tackled, because it would be safer for people on the streets and better for the local residents.
Councillor, I know you've brought this up before because we've talked about this as well with vehicles, cars with their exhaust and the noise. Now, the disturbance of the peace is definitely something, especially when we're talking about in the middle of the night, it can be massively affect your quality of life because it affects your quality of sleep, and it is a really big issue. I've had a conversation with I don't know if you've seen Owen Messenger, Sergeant Owen Messenger, he's the one who does the customised cars in policing, and he goes engages at the car meets and helps them ensure that they're legal in the way that they do things. Now, my question to him is, do you also talk to them? Are they aware about the impact of the noise levels of the things that they do? And I don't think they've actually had that conversation. I think the conversation's been about how do we keep motorcyclists safe? How do we keep vehicles, the customised vehicles and the silly driving younger people safe? But we haven't actually had a conversation of are you aware of the impact? I think that is a space where we need to go into, because while they think it's funny, I actually don't think the conversation's been had with them about the level of impact that's had. I think we have this discussion at our age group round this table, but we don't have the discussion with those cyclists or motorcyclists or with those vehicles. So I'm going to go away and speak particularly to Owen Messenger because he can engage with those particular groups. So I don't think we've had that conversation with the moving vehicle, what's the terminology that you call it? A moving offence, a traffic
moving vehicle offence or a traffic.
Yeah,
it is because vehicles are moving. And can I just say, whilst wheeling down Exeter Street might be young people, if you look at the value of the motorbikes around the Barbican on a Saturday and Sunday afternoon, it's not young people, it's probably more people our age that are causing a lot of the distress. And I hasten to say, it's also them who can be out at 3 or 4 in the morning.
So what we've particularly done around motorcyclists and the campaign that's running at the moment is we've worked with the Cabinet Office around their behavioural unit because we're trying to reduce motorcyclist deaths at the moment. And we have done a campaign where we have learned that you get people who are influencers in that community to help with your your conversations. So we have got, apparently he's well known in the biker community, reading out a letter from a chap who's given an apology for his stupid behaviour because of what's happened from it. So there has been some attempts to try and communicate to the wider community on that. That only got released, I'm going to say, a week ago. In fact, I think all councillor advocates at that road safety seminar saw an early doors version of it, but it literally has only just been released now. So it's the comms effort alongside actually the physical effort of enforcing things as well that's been going on. But I'm very proud of the efforts that we're trying to make to communicate better with a cohort of people that wouldn't be interested in listening to me at all.
Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Chair. Going on page 58, when we look at Safer Streets 4, you talk a little bit about violence against women and girls and the rapid response police car in Torquay. Is there any idea of bringing them to maybe Plymouth, Exeter, quite large cities, aren't they? Barnstaple, so on. I don't want to leave anyone out. But are we seeing any more coming our way?
Sorry, Councillor, can you point me to that in the report? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I can. Page 58, Safer Streets 4, number 7. First paragraph, go down, and it tells you that there is a new violence against women and girls rapid response police car in Torquay, and they're developing a new safety charter for venues in our nighttime economies. So I'm just wondering if we're going to see any more of the rapid response to police cars, please.
Sorry, I've just found it. I was looking at a completely different part. That hasn't been fully evaluated, or we haven't actually looked at the evaluation of that one yet, but Safer Streets 5 has been announced. We've just had a report last night that it looks like I will be getting around £1 million to spend in this round of Safer Streets. So I've yet to fully decide what that goes on, how that fully looks. So on 24th of August, I've got to get the proposal into government on those Safer Streets ones. So if anyone wants to make any representations to me, I'd be more than welcome.
I welcome that, and I think that's probably something as local authorities we could actually do through our own members. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Lever.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your report, Alison. I'm looking at paragraph 12, section 12 of your report, which is on page 63. It says 63 here, and it's really about domestic abuse perpetrator funding. And I note with great disappointment that the bid to the Home Office was for an extension of that funding or replacement funding, whichever it was unsuccessful. And as the report says, this is despite there being strong evidence of need, independent evaluations of the success of the existing work, and the good partnership engagement in support of the funding. And I wondered if it sounds as though you perhaps had an idea that we would not be successful in that bid, because as your report says, you have planned for this possibility and so have found 200,000 from the reserves. I just wondered if we had more information about why the bid was unsuccessful and what has been lost as a result, and how we might go about trying to find other ways to support this very important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. The perpetrator funding, let's be absolutely frank, we've been trying to tackle domestic abuse for generations, and we've always focused on the victim. And I would say that you can keep throwing money at trying to stop women or men who are victims of domestic abuse from being in those relationships or being in those situations, but we've never had a comprehensive programme to help people who are the perpetrators. So it's been a gap for the government, for us, all of us, in terms of our local authority commissioning, in terms of anything that works well with a perpetrator in order to change their behaviour. So I was really delighted when we got the first round of money. We were very ambitious in pushing for the next lot of money. And I think for us, and I would suggest when we go through the budget process, that will be an opportunity for my office to consider, because it's a gap. we've got to work out a way to fill it. Whether I've got enough money to even start beginning to fill that gap, I need to have a look at in the budget round when I look at the commissioning for the following year. So I've set aside £200,000. That's how strongly I believe that we need to have something around the perpetrator side. So I haven't got a full answer for you today, but perhaps through the budget process you may want to scrutinise if I have or haven't included something around the perpetrator funding in my commissioning arrangements, and you can have a challenge me on that if I have or haven't.
Roger Coate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not a question. Can I just endorse the domestic abuse perpetrator funding? Devon County Council were awarded £1.4 million this year. Hopefully it will continue, and I look forward to working very much with the Commissioner and the OPCC in pushing this forward. As she said, we've been looking at this for eons, it would appear. Anyway, this often hidden crime, and we've been focused on the victims all the time, virtually. We need to start looking at the perpetrators, and it's not a quick thing, it's a generational thing. We should be looking at the children of the perpetrators, because they learn from their fathers, mostly fathers, and it comes into the next generation. So we need to really major on this, and I shall be supporting anything that can go into the budget for this coming year, and I look forward working closely with the Commissioner. That's that one. Number two, my second one, I think I'd just like to add to the Commissioner's remarks about Vivian Pengelly, the sad loss of Vivian Pengelly. I've known Vivian for 30 years and worked very closely with her on very many things, and she brought a wealth of experience to this panel and certainly helped to me when I was chair of the panel. So I would like to formally, if it can be done, I don't quite know how to do it, but I'd like to formally say that the panel sort of thank Vivian for all her years' work in police matters particularly. And I know her son is quite a high, I think he was something in the Met for many years as well. So I'd just like to formally bring the panel's attention to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we'll make sure those comments are officially noted in the minutes. Thank you. Commissioner. Did you want to respond to those other points, or you? Okay. Councillor Toms.
Thank you. Could I thank the Commissioner for coming to Lou and having a look at our small town, and you know the advent of the inquiry office opening next year will be well supported in the town, I'm sure. The thing for me is that whilst we're having this, the previous report that would have been about the non-urgent call service, then you know I'd have asked the same question. Do you think that having these extra offices open will release some of the pressure on the non-emergency service? You know, because people will give up for 45 minutes. They could probably walk to a police inquiry office and report it and walk back in small places like Lou.
Thank you, Councillor. And it was delightful to come to Lou the other week, and you have reminded me of the excellent work that between yourself and the inspector locally have done to tackle shoplifting in Lou is exemplary. The efforts that you've gone to go into schools, to actually deal with individuals. I'm very impressed with the relationship between policing and councillors that we have got across our patch. I am hoping there is a reduction in the level of people needing to call the police through 101. But the reality, it's more about, firstly, about choice. Some people just need to speak to somebody face to face, particularly if they've been a victim of quite a horrific crime. They may want that emotional support from somebody straight away. So I think there's an element of giving people choice when they've become a victim about how they actually communicate that with policing. But secondly, there are opportunities for technology, and how much for panel members that have been here for some time, the technology challenges in policing, ones that I can never promise will ever be delivered on time. But what I will say is there is a technology opportunity where we should be able to enable police inquiry officers' front desks to answer the 101 phones. At the moment, it's held within a couple of locations, but there is a possibility where it could actually be answered from anywhere. So that would actually help with the control room times as well. But fundamentally, this is a cultural shift I'm trying to create in policing. This is about saying people are important. The closure of the front desks and the retraction in neighbourhood policing, the retraction from the public that's happened over the years. I am trying to support the police to rethink their relationship with communities and be a lot more open and willing. And I think in such a difficult climate of public confidence, the reopening of front desks is the right thing, and it does set a bar that the public are important. And I think that's another issue as to why I'm trying to get as many as I can reopened in communities. If you're paying more in your council tax and you're never going to see a police officer walk your street, you at least want to know there's a police station you can go to get support when you need it. So I think that's, for me, a bit fundamental there.
Thank you. My list is now exhausted, so I will propose... Oh, apologies, councillors.
Sorry, Chair, I thought you clocked me because you looked this way, but I should.
No, I was verbally told, but I didn't get your name on the list.
Right,
so,
okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for the report, Commissioner. Firstly, just referring to page 56, I was very glad to have been invited to Commissioner's showcase on victim services and support you put into that as a councillor advocate. It was a real eye-opener, and there's a lot that I saw there that you don't bring forward so much in your report, so it was invaluable, so thank you very much for that. My questions are around page 58, again, the Safer Streets for an Operation Low-Key number 7. And it's around legacy, really. So in Exeter, as you know, we were really glad to receive a big chunk from Safer Streets 4, and the CCTV uplift provision has had such a high impact in the city because of the work that's now carrying on with officers within the council and some funding that's gone into that. They're able to now carry on operating with that. But there are some things where the legacy stops. So one of the things is the safe space, which the funding for that came out of Safer Streets 4. I've been volunteering. They have done 6 overnight shifts, and I can really see the absolute benefit to the city, the amount of ambulance calls it's managed to put off through that. It's freed up police time because of being able to take people in and do general first aid, let people sit and recover without having police having to wait with them while an ambulance turns up. So there's loads of data, which I'm going to send you if you haven't had already. But I will be contacting you about a bid for Safer Streets 5 that would include that. Operation Loki, again, was very successful in Exeter, and lots of really good statistics from that. But what this absolutely proves is it was so successful, people felt safer, there were loads of arrests made, valid arrests, from repeated criminal behaviour that carries on in that area. So it was targeted on Sidwell Street in Exeter. But the downside of that is we all knew that once it stopped, everything would return. And it took about 4 or 5 weeks to return to where it was. So when we've got valuable data that comes out of an operation such as this, Can I ask you, please, would you support a request from Exeter to the acting Chief Constable to make that uplift of 4 more officers in Exeter on a permanent basis? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. I think what you've done is spur me on to ask as the first question to the Acting Chief Constable as neighbourhood policing and what the next steps are around that just generally. But what is the next steps after Op Loki? I'm aware that the prior Chief Constable, who's currently not with me at the moment, was very keen to establish mini Op Loki teams that could be moved around so that if it got displaced, we could really come in and help a local neighbourhood team who then weren't distracted by other matters. So the local neighbourhood team could get on with things. So I will go back and ask that question to see how that has progressed, with an expectation that hopefully something will be happening this year as opposed to it being pushed into the long grass.
Thank you. And finally, Councillor Penberley, if you could make this very brief. Thank you.
I will do, Chair. I think last time we commented that we were disappointed, although it being an adjourned meeting, that there was a lack of performance monitoring and there was a system glitch. Once again, despite the fact it's a few weeks later, the system glitch hasn't resolved and we didn't have performance monitoring figures available for now. My question is, if we haven't got them, we can't scrutinise you. That presumably means you haven't got them. How are you ensuring that you are accurately doing your holding to account on your strategic objectives if you do not have the monitoring information with which to do so?
Thank you, Councillor. You won't have the performance update in here because this is the same agenda as one that didn't happen a few weeks ago. So there was no extra work put into the agenda to, it's the meeting that didn't happen, is what we're sitting here today. I'm pleased to tell you that performance information is now available. It's one of the reasons why I've found out that we are the lowest crime rate area in the country at the moment, but we will bring that to you to the next meeting. Some of the challenges have been around this system change, as you know, from what was known as Unify to Niche, but they have managed to resolve a lot of those problems. It was a tricky time to hold to account in that particular period. A lot of the data that they were looking at was, if you like, unchecked, unverified, and it was all given to us with caveats of it may be this far out, it may be this confidence levels. So I think in terms of that, it was tricky. I totally accept that there was a difficulty in doing that, but really pleased to see that the data is fully back online, and that's actually good news. And the Chief Constable's been really pushing, ensuring that our crime data integrity is high, so we're really clear about whether we're confident in those figures as well. So yeah, apologies that you didn't have it in this pack as part of the last meeting. It will definitely be with you at the next one.
I know the last meeting wasn't quorum and was therefore cancelled. This is therefore a new meeting. We did, whilst not quorum, request that if they were possible, that was added to the agenda items at the time. And you did say that, yes, you would be happy to do so. So because there was nothing there, I assumed, therefore, that nothing had been done in terms of further progress in your glitch. It is useful to at least, I think, if there are no performance figures available, to put in any paper, whether it's a scheduled meeting or a rescheduled meeting, why there aren't, because they should be there, why they are. Thank you.
I think we have the work programme coming up later as well, so that will give us an opportunity to sort of plan the year ahead. Okay, I think it's time we moved on. I will propose we note the report as chair. Vice Chair to second. All in favour? That's unanimous. Thank you. Okay, we move back to item 9. I'm going to propose we take this as read and go straight into questions. Councillor.
Sorry, I just have a quick question, which is less about the response time, but once response happens, what happens next? There have been a number of issues recently in the city where we've been encouraging people to report either through online form or through 101, because they were ongoing issues where it was about building the level of evidence rather than it being a specific crime incident. But they were short term. I'm trying not to go too much into detail. What we were hearing afterwards, as we've done some debriefs, is that the amount of time it takes for some of the information to get through to the front line means that actually it's slowing down some of the ability for local policing inspectors with their teams to work out how to respond and get appropriate advice in order to deal with growing issues in communities. And this is one that we have some responsibilities for as a local authority, but also the policing have responsibility, and it's how we work in tandem in a consistent way for communities. So I wondered whether, as well as looking at response times, you can look at if some information comes into the 101 system especially, how long it then takes that to get down to the frontline policing teams. Because if people are reporting, that's one good thing, and if it's managing to come through. But then if there's delays in it getting out to the people who are going to operationalise the evidence and the data that's coming in, then that's a further glitch. It's only come up in the last sort of month or so because of some specific things in Plymouth, but I just thought it was worth adding that there's seems to be a second glitch in the system.
Thank you, Councillor. One of the ways that we've tried to ensure that there is a good information with police officers is the Councillor Advocate Scheme, so that where councillors are aware of community issues, they have that direct opportunity to speak to the local inspector. But what you're talking about now is a whole nother report, and I would like to just share with you, in terms of the chair, the action that I have taken, that I have had to share with you today. I would say please be aware that there are limited resources in my office to be able to supply you with every type of report that you may need. So I'm just pushing back a little bit, Chair, just in terms of what I'm able to supply you in a time frame that would be helpful for you to know. But I can take that specific query away and get you an individual answer if that is helpful.
I think it was more of a principle. If it was building an evidence base around drugs, it might not be that something has to happen relatively quickly. There are, as we're all aware, at this time of the year, circumstances where councils have to take action against unauthorised encampments. The police also have powers but need to build the same evidence base. If it's taking 24 hours or longer for 101 information to get through to frontline policing, it means that police are not actually able to respond in appropriate ways to community tensions that might be rising, which wouldn't be about councillor advocates. It would actually be about an ongoing issue. And that was about 101 reporting getting through to the frontline policing teams who are trying to work out whether they have an evidence base that means they move faster than us or we move faster than them. So it is one that isn't we've got a mugging going on now, there's shoplifting going on now, or we're picking up a lot of traffic about drugs. It's something that's somewhere in between. And I think it's in those sorts of circumstances that we just need to make sure that information gets through, because we're telling people not to put 999 unless it's risk of life or limb, because we're trying to save you getting people going to the 101 or 999 being clogged up. And we're trying to encourage people to report online, but there needs to be that information flow through. So it is a sort of specific thing that I think seasonally a lot of our councils will be dealing with at the moment, and it's one that I think is an unusual bit, but one where, with changes in your powers, or the police powers, we do need to be able to react well. So that's a bit of broader context to what I was saying. And there's been a number of issues recently about whether police would or wouldn't have used powers, depending on whether they got the information. And certainly there's at least one where they would have done. And that would have saved some community angst and behaviour. So thank you.
Okay, any further questions? Yes.
With regard to timings and weights, etc., for being able to get through, when we were talking about some of the stations being opened, we hope that actually, when they haven't got anybody in, You know, they could be answering 101 calls. Will that really sort of help drop that figure down? Because I've, you know, highlighted the National League table, and we do seem to be getting better and then dropping again. So, you know, you said about the changes of April in the report, and we only have the figures for May at the moment. So that looks like we sort of dropped a place. So when we get the next set of data, I think that could be quite interesting to see if your plans had worked from April with speaking to a contact officer. Sorry, Commissioner, it's page 50. And can I just add, I found the typo for your office. It's down on 5.2A, the very last line. It's improvement since November 23, and that's a bit that should be 22 as well. I knew there was 2 Novembers in there.
Thank you, Councillor. Yes, so if you look at that league table on 5, in terms of where we are in context of other forces, I can tell you what June's updated data is. We are number 10. So I think there's been some real efforts to, as I've said, prioritise the answering of 999 calls over 101 to ensure that people are responded to in an emergency. And the fix in 101 is a longer term plan that we've got in place, but really pleased to see that Devon and Cornwall are in the top 10 for answering 999 calls, which is a huge improvement from where we were, and contextually just helps you see, we can visibly see there's been some improvement. Let's hope it stays. You know, I'll be happy. They don't have to go to number 1 for me on that. As long as they stay in the top quartile, I think that's a reasonable place to be for 999.
May I just follow up? Do we know that, we know that we have the lowest crime rate? We also know, on the other scale, that we have one of the highest fears of crime. So do we get more calls? Yes, we are a very large area, but do we seem to get more calls that people are just worried about things, or are they, I want to say real crimes, but, you know, something that really does need to be reported?
I haven't got the breakdown in full of everything that comes through 101, but let me just give you a flavour of, you've probably seen in the news this week, there's been a national agreement that's been developed now in relation to how police respond to mental health calls for service. That's one element that there's trying to look at a reduction in, so that the right people help an individual, and it's not always the police. So in terms of what comes for our communities, what I would say, and this is a general comment about our communities rather than the detail and the data that I've got on 101. This is just from my own experience, my own knowledge, and our communities, is we have a very active community that don't tolerate crime. So they are very active in trying to communicate that there's a problem in their communities and they want it resolved. That's a really positive thing. We have a very active community that understand, I believe, how to contact the police, and they have very high expectations of the police, and that's why we also have a high number of complaints against policing for Devon and Cornwall compared to a lot of other forces. And I think it's to do with the expectations of our community versus how our officers perform against other forces. I think the calls that we get in is because people want to help. That is our culture down here. We are resilient and we survive down here on a peninsula because we're interested in our community. So I think there is an element of that, but that's just contextually I'm giving you that information as opposed to data-driven, because I don't have that in front of me.
Thank you for that, and that's a really good answer. Thank you very much. I don't need anything else. That covers it. Thank you.
Thank you. And members, I think we're really going to have to pick up the pace now. So in future, for the rest of the agenda, if we make questions very, very quick fire, and I think I'll be taking questions in batches as well for the Commissioner. I'm sure she'll be able to cope with that. Okay, Councillor Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, I note the target answer for priority 1 calls is 5 minutes. Can you help me to understand why we changed to the system of simplifying, because looking at the papers in April, we were taking a fifth within 5 minutes on P1, and P2 was somewhere north of 50 minutes. So how will simplifying help us to meet our priority 1 targets? Accept that 999, that's brilliant progress. But of course the reality is what you've just said anecdotally about people wanting to help, they'll only want to help on 101 if their calls are going to be answered in good time. So hitting that 5-minute target is going to be really important. I don't see how mixing the two helps that.
So fundamentally, if you go to report on 101, you could be reporting an inconsiderate parking arrangement in your street or a victim of rape. And this is what we're trying to... So P1 and P2 is this priority 1. If you've been a victim of a serious crime, priority 1. If it's something else, which is the bulk of what the calls come through on, it all goes into P2. Some of the simplifying elements is not giving people too much choice of which button to press. And also we've introduced triage on the, which is so that everyone gets a human voice when they ring 101 and then have to wait in the queue. But we never had the triage in place. And that's the new element that's been brought in to help understand the stress of the caller and to get it right. So for that to me is simplifying the process, because you're getting the right people to the right place slightly quicker.
Thank you. I propose we note the report as chair, vice chair to second. All in favour? Thank you. That's unanimous. Moving on to item 11. The draft annual report. Again, I propose we take as read. Are there any questions? No? Okay. I'll propose as chair. Vice chair, second. All in favour? Again, that's unanimous. Thank you. Item 12, complaints against the Police and Crime Commissioner. I see there are no formal complaints received against the Commissioner in the last period. So again, I'll propose are there any questions? I propose we note the report. Seconded. All in favour? Thank you. Now move on to the work programme. So are there any items of interest or matters for discussion that members would like to see at our future meetings? Now is the time to place it firmly on the radar. Councillor Toms.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. When I was doing my research for the gun crime and all the rest of it, I come across some other stuff that really interested me. If you think that in 2010 to about 2016 we reduced by 20,000 officers across the country, that was a significant decrease, because the people that went were in the older group, and the 30-year officers who had lots of experience. We're now recruiting again, and those recruits are gradually coming through training, but instead of doing 2 years like most of the other officers did, they're doing a 3-year training course now. So it makes a big difference. And when you think the population growth is since about 2010 is somewhere between 3 and 5 million people throughout the country. And if you just take Cornwall from 2010 to now, the increase is 38,000. That is more population than any town in Cornwall. I think 26,000 is St Austell, 25 or 24 is in Truro. So, we're talking about a significant number. I'd like to see a bit of work that helps the Commissioner go to government and say, you need to think about this, because, the increases in Plymouth, because I've seen all the new developments around Plymouth that are making an impact on policing and other services, and across Devon will be exactly the same. Torquay will be the same. So I'd like to see us do some work to aid the Commissioner to get more money, and if that makes sense, I think we should at least do something about that, leading up to the budget process later in the year.
Thank you, Councillor Toms. We have looked at funding formulas in the recent past. However, your comments and suggestions have been noted, and I think rather than debating the merits of each topic at the moment, if we just record them and make a list, that will sort of set us in good stead. So thank you, Councillor. Councillor Lever.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just looking at the work programme here and referring back to the minutes of the previous meeting where it talked about the recruitment and retention plan that would be available for, well, input November 2022 for summer 2023 panel. I can't see that here. Retention is obviously a really important part of the workforce strategy for the police. We're hearing anecdotally that it's quite difficult to get younger trainees who are offered jobs in the northern part of Devon, who then can't find anywhere to live because there's nowhere to live. And I just wondered if the retention strategy was going to be coming to a future meeting.
Thank you again. That suggestion has been noted, and we'll record that as a suggestion. Thank you. Any other suggestions? Councillor.
Rather than it being a suggestion, during the course of today's discussions, there have been a number of matters raised that have been more about we need to look at this a bit further. There are some interesting bits coming out. And those sort of probably were thread-like rather than specific bits. I just wondered whether it was possible for the Democratic Support Team with yourself and the Vice Chair to actually review some of those and work out what those might mean for the work programme rather than us trying to work through all of today's notes again to work what those might be.
Yes, and Ross has just made a suggestion as well that if members want to go back to their individual authorities and pick up any feedback and email, I think because the time is ticking and the last meeting was cancelled, should we set a deadline on that, Ross? Or? No? Just leave that open. Yeah, okay. Okay.
Chairman, may I just add, Councillor Wright mentioned about Op Loki and it ends and then what? And we have got an opportunity to share with the panel an evaluation of Op Loki, and it would be an opportunity for you to ask pointed questions about antisocial behaviour if you wanted me to bring that to a future panel for you.
Thank you. Yes, and to answer that point earlier, there is delegated authority over the work programme for the Chair, the Vice Chair and the officers, so that gives us a little bit of flexibility. I just wanted a bit to gauge some of the feedback today to help with that, but thank you for that. So I think that concludes the work programme for today. So moving on, Ross, because there are one or two new members of the panel, we put our expenses into Plymouth City